So you'll see it.
Well, hey, there it is.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's Kristi. It's been a while since I've seen you guys. Oh, there's the live button. Maybe now we're live. Anyway, it's always delayed. It's always awkward. Anyway, let's just start fresh. Hey, how are you doing? It's Kristi. It's been a while since I've seen you guys, but because of the live stream for women, A Day Without a Woman, I definitely didn't want to go the whole time without showing you guys my face. Although when I do screen share, it gets lagged, so I might switch back over to my avatar then, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, to start the live stream off, I'm having a chat today with a person that I've interacted with through social media, and she has some expertise that we are going to be bringing up and discussing and unpacking in terms of history and the study of history and feminism. And then later on in the live stream, we'll be joined by other guests and other topics. But for right now, Horikawa, welcome to the show.
Hello, it's nice to finally be talking to you with voices this time. It's quite fancy.
Rather than through thumbs.
Yes.
Yeah, so you have a specialty in an area that I don't know a lot about, so I'm here to ask questions and do a lot of listening. And why don't you start off by telling our audience a little bit about, in terms of your level of comfort, kind of how you got interested in history and how you've been following it in terms of a career path.
Well, yeah, so obviously I'm a little bit more complicated than just being history. What I study is what's known as cultural history or social history sort of thing, which means I study not simply the sort of political history, which is what people often study, you know, X politician passed Y bill doing Z thing, but history of social movements, particularly as they relate to cultural enterprises. So things like theater, things like texts and movies and plays, all this sort of thing.
And what do those things tell us about a society?
Often first off, often they tell us the only things we know about a society. So sort of a dirty little secret in history is that a lot of times we don't really have as solid a footing as we would perhaps want. So, when you read sort of things talking about the economy of, say, Byzantine peasants or something like that, and these textbooks that talk about these sort of things often talk about them in a very hard fashion, like this is something we definitely know. But the texts that we base a lot of these claims on are not always things like, you know, record books by the government as to taxes paid or something. Oftentimes those exist, but sometimes they get lost, sometimes they get destroyed, etc. So oftentimes when we're painting pictures of societies and cultures, whether it's economy, whether it's gender relations, whether it's culture, whatever, a lot of times what we base those on are texts, or are fictional texts, because fictional texts always are based and anchored in a contemporary society. So for one example, there's been some decent work on a guy named Ihara Saikaku, and he talks a lot about economy and the plight of the working poor, so to speak. He would eventually become co-opted later on by the proletariat movements. And his texts you can read them a lot of different ways. There are a lot of stuff to read about gender relations there, but you can also read them in terms of just how people pay for things, what the costs of living for certain professions are. He goes into great depth into each of these sorts of fields. And so social history and cultural history and these sorts of basing yourself on these sorts of texts like plays, fiction books, even poetry, although I do a lot less work on poetry than some people I know, can be quite reflective of all sorts of lived experience of the contemporary to their creation and consumption.
Now, if I can, there's it's a question that might require more time to, again, unpack. Sure. When you say the word culture, what does that word mean in terms of how you use it and how you use it on an academic level?
Well, I don't think the academic use of the word culture is too terribly different from contemporary sort of lay use of the term. Culture refers to a particular moment in time, shared cultural values, and things that people kind of, for example, in contemporary American culture, you could say contemporary American culture has a heavy emphasis on freedom. Now, what exactly freedom means depends a lot on the individual, but there is this sort of shared sense that freedom is a very important aspect. as well as other things can comprise American culture. So things like the Avengers movies are part of American culture. They're also part of British culture. They're also part of German culture, probably. But they're interpreted in very different ways, different in local contexts. So this sort of thing is what we would consider culture. Now, culture is to be differentiated from cultured. And so one thing I study in particular is early 20th century Japanese intellectual discourse. So this is something I'm very interested in. The history of Japanese science in particular is something I've become quite enamored with lately. And so over the last couple of years. And so often in these sorts of discourses, you will see culture being portrayed as a progression, as, you know, this is part of eugenics discourse. So we're not using culture in anything resembling this sort of hierarchical thing, but simply shared sets of values, beliefs, not quite nationalism, because it's a different sort of thing, but things that comprise things that are indicative of a group of people. And often, of course, culture is also a misleading thing. It's an erasing thing. When you say, for example, Edo Japanese culture, Edo is 1600 to 1868. Which culture are you talking about? Are you talking about the city life? Are you talking about working class farmers? So culture is a complicated thing, and it can be problematized, I think, very successfully. But that's typically kind of what I mean. It's not, in a professional use, it's not really too different from a lay use.
I think culture can sometimes be a bit misleading because it sounds like a singular, where in practice it's really a collection of many different things.
Yes.
You know, more like a patchwork than a single piece of art. You know, it's not a solid, consistent sort of thing that has a shape. It's made up of a lot of subcultures and marginalized things and people who operate within different cultures because of where they are in that society, as you were pointing out.
Yeah, and this gets actually even worse or better, depending on your perspective, the further back you go. Because the further back you go, particularly when you go into civilizations that are, and that's a problematic term too, but I'm going to use it because I'm fast and loose like that, I guess. But civilizations that are pre-mass media, pre-printing press, or in Japan, woodblock printing. And even after woodblock printing, things are still very fractured. And so in any sort of media or any sort of group of people where you don't have the ability to mass produce and share ideas very easily and very quickly across huge distances, you're going to get very particular groups and cultures. I don't do as much work in the pre-Edo. My specialization begins in around 1600, goes to about the mid-20s in Japan. A little bit in 30s. I have some experience with occupation period as well. But I do know a bit about a decent amount actually, about pre-Edo. And so in this pre-1600 world, before woodblock printing was really a thing that many people did, you had a very stark differences between aristocratic cultures, which were heavily focused on things like poetry, in particular visions of the world that focused on nature and all this stuff. And then also monks sitting in their temples had very different sorts of cultures and produced very different, cultural artifacts. And so you see heavy fractures. Like if you think contemporary society is heavily fractured with subcultures, it's nothing compared to these pre-mass media worlds.
So coming on to kind of bring in International Women's Day and all of this, obviously a lot of these producers were male, especially the authors, and so history tends to, I would imagine, the written history and the artistic history reflect that side more than others. So when you're doing a cultural study, maybe this is a way we could kind of segue into sort of the emergence of feminist critique and feminist epistemology or methodology. I think you used the word epistemology in our discussions, but
yeah, methodology is probably what I meant. But so it's interesting because you say that, and I want to go back just a little bit, because you say that often the producers of these cultural artifacts are male. In Japan, this is very often true, but Japan is kind of unique in that it has an extremely strong female cultural producer culture until about the 1600s. So Japan's sort of most respected novel, for example, is something known as the Genji Monogatari, or the Tale of Genji. This is, to date, the rough equivalent to, I don't know, Hamlet, I guess, would be, but it's actually even more elevated in Japan. And this was written by a woman named Murasaki Shikibu. Additionally, beyond that, at the same time period, contemporary to this, or approximately within this that sort of span, you also saw things like Sei Shonagon, a woman who wrote the Pillow Book, Makura no Soshi. And you saw all of this sort of female-produced media. There's a lot of theories as to why this was. Interestingly, it kind of comes from a place of female depowerment. Well, one theory, I'm not sure I subscribe to it, but one theory is that in Japan, way back when, there were multiple methods of writing literature. You could write in Chinese characters and classical Chinese, a literary language meant for intellectuals. And you also had vernacular language written in kana, which was intended for women. It was a lesser language, but it was native Japanese. It was not literary Chinese. And so this was these women's native languages. So one theory, and I'm not sure I subscribe to it, like I said, is that because these women were writing in their native tongue and not a foreign tongue, they were actually able to produce better literature as a result. And so generally speaking, you see women's literature surviving and men's literature not surviving, at least in this pre-1600 era. Things begin to shift rather rapidly after that.
And what was the state of like women's literacy and participation in the era before that, in the era after, just to give that a bit of context?
So it's very complicated. And like I said, a lot of this is being, like, first off, like I said, I'm not a specialist in any way in this pre-1600 era. The Heian, the Kamakura, the Muromachi, all this stuff. I'm not a specialist. But that said, and we also just don't have many sources from this time period. But what we can tell is that women largely weren't supposed to be literate in literary Chinese, but many were, at least if they were aristocrats, because their parents would kind of covertly teach them, or they'd teach them and, you know, no one would care, or something to that degree. So a decent amount were, but it was exceptional. So it was a non-zero number, but it was relatively low. In terms of writing, and right now we're talking strictly about the aristocracy. In terms of writing in kana, in vernacular Japanese, relatively high. And again, we're talking strictly aristocracy. If we go outside the aristocracy, literacy is extremely low, near zero. Now this changes in 1600, interestingly. The aristocracy pretty much remains the same. Aristocracy it's less powerful in the 1600s, but it's still doing its own thing. But the common people, because mass media becomes a thing, capitalism becomes a thing, and merchants begin selling to a common working class, and this can include women. Because of this, while interestingly, and I don't know the reason for this, female authorship declines substantially, but female readership and female literacy explodes. So women become very active readers, but less active writers.
Right.
I'm not sure why.
Chrisiousity has joined us.
Yes, hello.
And she's...
Hello. I didn't want to interrupt what was a very interesting conversation, though, so...
Maybe.
You were doing perfectly. Yeah, I was going to ask about why it's important to study women's history and women's contributions in these ways.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a thing about representation. So, in particular, right now, there's been a rather large dearth of study on women's history and women's culture. This goes into sort of what we were talking about a little bit earlier off call in terms of history department funding. So a lot of women's studies, sort of history, historians that focus on women's issues, about 10 or 20 years ago, rarely got funding, rarely got any support. And only recently has this really started to change. And we've started to see an explosion recently in women's studies and women's funding, but it's still problematic, and not all departments are equally suited for this. So a lot of times what historians will do is they'll bleed off from a history department, because the history department only has a set number of funding, set amount of money, and sometimes some older people are involved and they want to talk about the military and whatever. And so people will go and work in relevant departments. So Arabic studies, Latin American studies, Japanese studies in my case, East Asian studies, Korean studies, etc. Or they'll go into something like women's studies or gender studies department, but focus on a historical thing. So I know a lot of people doing work on the history of sexuality in gender studies departments. And they're doing good historiography. They're doing good history, but they're not in a history department. So this is something that you see a lot. And there's just so much work to do because this topic has been ignored.
Yeah, what's the history? What's the history of these issues? Like, when is this something that emerged after second wave feminism in terms of academic interest and starting to build up a core of people with the skills to research these topics?
Yes and no. So, yes, at least in the West, you started seeing an explosion, especially in the 80s and 90s, with the birth of third wave feminism into these sorts of movements. I don't know as much about the history of history departments in terms of second wave feminism. I could see that maybe, I don't know. But at least with third wave feminism, you start seeing this become more of an issue in the West. But when you're talking about the history of a different culture, you're also going to be talking about the history of study, or the history of historical studies in a different culture as well. And in Japan, there's certainly been a lot of work, and in the West too, on particular women, on these canonical women I mentioned earlier. So Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote The Tale of Genji, like I said, this big canonical text. Sei Shonagon, who wrote Makura no Soshi, big canonical text. There's been a lot of work on particular women that for whatever reason have become canonical figures. But the work has always been rather, I think, fluffy in a lot of ways, talking about what makes their text so great, and not talking about the fact that they were women writers. They were more talking about the literature and less about their femaleness, which I think is a rather important part of them doing their thing, because, you know, a lot of times, especially in these older texts, you're talking about women who are cloistered away and not physically allowed to even see men. Like they're locked up almost in these sorts of female coterie environments that are very artificial. And so they're going to have a very particular vision of the world that's going to be very distinct. And so a lot of the history of these things in the West and in Japan has ignored this aspect and just talks about the texts as texts, which is fine, I guess. But and if you're talking about non-canonical women, so women that have not been entered into the canon, there's damn near nothing done until maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago. You don't really see anything in the West. And in Japan, this is still even largely the case. Japan tends to be a little bit lag behind American scholarship in a lot of ways. So you have some Japanese scholars who are doing really interesting work with lesser known female writers, but that sort of thing is relatively discouraged until you get like the equivalent of tenure in Japan, and then you can start doing your own thing. It's very new. So unless you're part of this, basically to answer your question, unless you're part of this small set of women, almost nothing's been done. And if you are part of the small set of women, things have been done, but your femininity has been revoked almost in part of the analysis.
Right. And were the previous people doing research on that, just out of curiosity, disproportionately men?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. Like,
didn't want to make
not even a
assumptions.
question.
Yeah.
No, that's not even a question. Yeah.
So you've got basically someone with a male experience reading a text written by a woman in a time period in a country that's completely foreign to him, kind of interpreting her experience through his experience. Not that we have like an authentic, you know, like because it's a woman reading a woman's text, suddenly I have an insight. But there might be things and themes, like you said, also with the context of how she lives, that you might see differently if you have a lived experience as a woman rather than, as a man. So, yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I would also caution against seeing things in, I'm not going to say it's simplistic, because I think there's something definitely there, but these terms of men and women don't exactly fit to men and women of the past. So obviously the cultural values are totally different, but also in terms of gender landscape. So there's a big push lately, and this is actually coming from Japanese scholarship, which tends to be pretty conservative. So I was very interested in this, of the establishment of a third sex, or a third gender, that was perceived during the Edo, so 1600 to 1868. This is a bit more in my wheelhouse. This is why I keep an eye on these sorts of things. So right now there's been several articles published speculating that there was a third gender at this time period, and that was comprised essentially of these people known as Chigo. Chigo being roughly equivalent to young boys that had sex with old monks, and
Okay.
Wakashu being a later version of that. This sort of non-shoku culture of pederasty or whatever during this time period. I've never actually said that out loud. I always just write it. So I don't know if I'm mispronouncing it. But
I think that's right. Yeah.
And these people who were involved in this thing were often perceived in very different ways from men and women. And there's some decent evidence to suggest they were conceived of as a third separate gender. So this kind of brings complicated questions in when you're talking about female perspectives, male perspectives. If you're talking about reading a text that deals with Chigo, can we even do that? Would be a question from our contemporary perspectives. Because even if we want to tie a perspective of, women of contemporary time period somehow having access to additional knowledge, perhaps through shared experiences of subjugation or something like that, albeit different the spectrum of subjugation, to women of the past, like the gender landscape needs to be considered whenever you do anything like that.
I like that phrase a lot. Can you expand on what you mean when you say the gender landscape?
So the gender landscape, this is something I don't think I've ever actually used in paper or anything. It's not really a term of art or anything, but it is, how I would explain it is how a contemporary culture, and by contemporary I do not mean modern like today, I mean a particular culture and time, how a particular culture and times envisions gender, and the how many genders there are, what sort of stereotypes are associated with certain genders, what kind of performances are expected of them, how they dress, what kind of lifestyles are expected of them. There's a really fascinating article in Recreating Japanese Women, 1600 to 1945. Incredible book. I highly recommend. There's that really kind of highlights the construction of motherhood, even, as being something, at least in the Japanese context, I can't speak about anything else, as being an artificial construct in the gender landscape that begins during the Meiji with the importation of Western scientific naturalism, stuff like that, which is very interesting. And so gender landscapes are these sort of norms, social structures, and perceptions. And how do we probe this? How do we figure out what the gender landscape is? Well, there's a bunch of ways you can do it. You had asked earlier what sort of things cultural artifacts like plays and texts can tell us. This is one of those things. We can learn something about the social norms conceived of by particular groups towards particular genders from these cultural artifacts. There's archaeological evidence, which can tell us at times some very telling things in terms of, particularly if we're talking about gender, women's health, childbirth, medicine, all of this sort of thing can help construct a gender landscape, as well as, let me see what else, pictures, art, anything like this helps.
Any kind of medical tools or something. Medical tools,
philosophical texts as well. So no matter what time period you're looking at, you're going to have people writing explicitly about gender. A lot of these texts are lost, so I can't say that definitively. Maybe during the Heian, they didn't write about gender. We don't really have much in terms of that, but I'm guessing they did, and it was lost. A lot of texts are lost from that time period. But especially when you start getting into the Edo, and mass media becomes a thing, and we have a lot more text once mass media becomes a thing. You see a lot of people writing these deep philosophical, almost manifestos on gender and what women should do and what kinds of women exist in the world. And they try and describe the different kinds of women, what we would call alternative femininities and alternative masculinities exist in the world and how they should act. And they begin publishing instructional texts. Now, of course, these are always going to be from a particular perspective. If you pick up Women Are from Venus, Men Are from Mars, that book or whatever, that's going to be from a very different perspective than potentially even mainstream audiences. But it can represent a perspective. So our gender landscape is not a static thing. It's a thing that's viewed from tons of different angles by tons of different people. I'm making weird motions with my hands right now and you can't see them. So that would be a gender landscape. So it's not just something that's constructed, it's something that's perceived and altered and modified by multiple actors at multiple times, often competing with one another.
That was a great answer. I wanted to give chrisiousity a chance to jump in case you had any questions or reflections.
Well, I'm not a historian, I'm not an academic, so bear that in mind. But one thing that I've been recently studying up on is the history of sex workers, and looking at that because it, basically because I've known some people who have sort of come up and asked me, what do I think about, this topic? And I like to have a historical perspective, and I like to have perspectives from different cultures before I jump in and just make up, only seeing it from my culture, only seeing it from the point of view of people I know, or what I know of it, because it's kind of like what you were talking about. We kind of take our own time and our own rules as givens, and everybody else's is going to be weird. But if you look through history, you realize the rules and the landscapes are always changing. They're always different.
There's that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. So I was just wondering, from the point of Japan, if they're, hey, hi.
How cute.
I'm enjoying. Oh, he thinks that he's giving you the eye, Kristi.
Oh.
He sees you on the screen. He's flirting. Yeah, so I'm involved right now in my motherhood construct. So just bear that in mind. Okay, but I guess I was curious about if there was sort of a tradition of sex work in Japan and what that was like. Hang on one second, I'll be right with you.
That's a question. Is there a tradition of sex work in Japan? Yeah. It's a highly cultured, I suppose, tradition of sex work. So sex work is often, at least in the West, perceived of as this kind of thing that's shoved off in a corner. We don't really talk about it. We know it happens. Maybe some specialists talk about it. Or if you're writing a novel that's particularly gritty or something, you might refer to it as a way of adding grit or real worldliness, or to take your novel, which might otherwise be quite lofty, being a novel, and bring it down to kind of the masses. This is a very common thing when we talk about sex work in the West. In Japan, very different. So in Japan, sex work has a long history, and it used to be very similar to the West. It was this taboo thing that you didn't really talk about, whatever. And then around 1600 or so, the Tokugawa government decided, well, we don't like that these people are hiding away criminals. So often a courtesan, which is the sort of term of art we use to refer to these women who are doing this, partially because it's a very different experience from a prostitute. But they didn't like that courtesans were hiding out lovers that were maybe doing tax evasion or something. They didn't like that they couldn't reliably tax and keep an eye on these sorts of things. And they saw a big money market, and also there were some morality. So Neo-Confucianism was a big thing. And so people would kind of say, like, okay, if this thing is going to exist, and it is going to exist, we at least want to have our hands on it somehow. And so they created this thing called the Yoshiwara district in Edo. Edo being the city that would eventually become Tokyo. So they created the Yoshiwara pleasure district. And this was a district full of courtesans, taiyu, people who would eventually become geisha. Taiyu and geisha, different entities, different feminine ideals that they performed for their patrons. But, you know, and this became kind of a symbol of the new modernity. And so you saw a lot of high fiction begin writing in stories of this sort of world of the sex worker. And, you know, so it was considered a kind of a high class experience, at least for the patrons. Now, for the women involved, it was rarely a voluntary thing. So capitalism started about 1600 in Japan in earnest, in big ways. And with capitalism can come income disparities and a lot of debt and a lot of poverty. And so you saw families that were potentially hard up. And one thing they would do is they would sell their daughters into these contracts to become courtesans for these male patrons. It wasn't quite slavery, I guess, in that women could then buy their contracts back if they managed to make enough money. But when you consider that the women involved had to buy their own clothes, had to buy their own makeup, had to buy their own materials, had to buy all of these sort of accoutrements of culture that their patrons would expect, they weren't supplied by their employers. And consider that often they weren't paid all that well unless they were a top courtesan. They were a bunch of different ranks. It was essentially slavery because most women could never pay it back. Some women did. And often there was real love involved. So it's a little bit different than women on the street corner, for example, selling their bodies.
So a patron would sort of have, would be almost in a relationship with a particular person.
That's
usually?
very common. Yeah, that would be very common. So oftentimes you would see one person frequent one particular courtesan or one or two particular courtesans. That's very common. As well as note that courtesans did have the ability to reject their patrons as well. This was not necessarily enforced, although if you did it, especially if you did it too often, your house mother, so to speak, would be less than pleased. So you would be pressured into accepting more men than perhaps you would want to. So there was some agency there. And some women did actually manage to get a lot of power and enjoy their time, but that was not the norm. So that's kind of the history of, but at the same time, it was this heavily celebrated enterprise and loftily spoken of, even by what scant female writers we have. They loved sort of this idea of this floating world of the courtesan that people could access and get this high art experience from. So different from, and this is also what informs contemporary Japanese discourses on prostitution. These sorts of discourses are still around. They evolved once Western naturalism and Western morality starts getting imported in the Meiji, which is 1868 to 1912. You start to see this change. But at the same time, nothing ever goes away completely. So you'll still see a glorification of prostitution in contemporary Japan in a very different way than contemporary Western cultures because of this lineage.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, so when you went through your training, did you have a particular like section or part of a course that dealt with feminist critiques?
So this is something I had wanted to talk about a little bit. So I've taken a course on feminist methodologies. And this was a course I thought was relatively good. In it, we studied standpoint theory, we studied postmodern theory, we studied empiricism, we studied all of these sorts of methodological approaches to data. And in terms of history, you don't get as many sort of methods classes. A lot of your history classes, they exist and they're dedicated to these things, but a lot of the day-to-day history is determining whether which sources can be reliable, which sources can be not reliable, etc. And this is something I see as a little bit problematic, because I would like to see a little bit more overlap here, because a lot of things I think have applicability. And contemporary historians and contemporary cultural studies people and things like that are learning this more and more. But there's kind of a problem. There's a very severe disconnect. So when I took this feminist methodologies class, it claimed to be a class for all sorts of humanities and social science. But then they just talked about sociology almost the entire time. There was pretty much nothing but sociology, which is fine.
Was it taught by a sociologist?
A political scientist.
Oh, okay, well, that's the closest we get. Yeah.
Yeah.
We think we're being really inclusive when political scientists teach sociology. We're like, oh, I'm getting out of my sphere.
And well, that's kind of the thing. And I was also somewhat disturbed because often I've taken a bunch of gender studies classes as well. I'm working on a graduate certificate in the topic alongside of my graduate degree. And often you see this dialogue about, cross-discipline sort of studies, about working in multicultural sources to inform a better perspective on the world. But at least in the courses I've taught, they're awfully Western. Like I don't think ever seen an East Asian source. And there are East Asian feminists. There's East Asian feminist methods. There's East Asian feminist theories out there. And some have even been translated to English, and they've tended to be ignored. So one thing I would definitely like to see more of, and my main critique of that course, I thought it was an excellent course, and it really did teach me a lot about feminist standpoint theory, about all these sorts of different things, intersectionality, all of this sort of thing. But I would love to see the disciplines broaden, to start considering other disciplines, particularly history, particularly literary studies, cultural studies, all of these sorts of things in their approaches to methods, and also beginning to work in sources that are not American, British, maybe if you're feeling spicy, some Latin American source to kind of make you feel like you're doing work, like you feel like you're doing international outreach or something, but always Western and almost always first world, or global North, I think is the new term for that. Probably the one exception I took a course on history of sexuality, which I took in a gender studies department. It was excellent. So I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah, so while we were chatting, we were joined by two guests, Laura and Kevin. So first, Laura, would you like to say hi? Or maybe not. Hey, while she's testing her mic, Kevin, how about you? How's your mic coming along?
Hello.
Yes, that's worked just fine.
Awesome. Hello, women, people.
Hello, man, people.
Hello.
Yeah. You have quite the beard there.
Absolutely. I mean, I am bringing my maleness to the table.
Oh, yeah.
So I want to pick your brain a little bit more while we have you, Horikawa. And the question I have, and other people can come in with questions too, especially if you want to write them in the chat, then I'll know you have a question. But you mentioned standpoint theory, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what standpoint theory is and how it helped you in terms of your analysis or your understanding.
So standpoint theory is, I would say everything kind of helps me. I'm not someone who's dedicated to one particular ideological or methodological approach. So I'll sometimes use standpoint theory to inform me, and I'll sometimes use postmodernism to inform me, and I'll sometimes, seemingly paradoxically use empiricism to inform me, these kind of polar opposite ideas of postmodernism and empiricism. It really depends on what sources I'm working on. So since you asked about standpoint theory in particular, I just wanted to make that clear, that it really depends on sources and time period and what I've got access to. Because sometimes you can't use empiricism. Sometimes you've got to use something else to get something out of, scant sources. So in terms of standpoint theory, to broadly define it, standpoint theory is essentially that people in particular context have particular standpoints that you're going to, for example, if you're a Nazi in Germany in 1940, whatever, and you're reading Hamlet, you're going to read it in a very different way than an American from that time period. If you're a contemporary American who is white, you're going to probably read a text. If you're a white male, average white male, this is not, I should say, so a lot of people misinterpret this. This is not saying that 100% of people do this. It's kind of an aggregate, an average person of these demographic backgrounds. So if you're sort of your average white male heterosexual person, you're going to read, in contemporary America, you're going to read a text like the Vagina Monologues, or go to a performance of it, and have a very different kind of experience. Yes, I suppose so. Have a very different kind of experience than a contemporary Black lesbian or something in America. And so, because of this, and this is especially important, I think, when you're looking at sources. So this is something historians already talk about, and talked about before standpoint theory was really a thing. Whenever you approach any text, you're always going to ask, who wrote it? What kind of things are they going to notice that other people won't? So if you're looking at, so in Chinese history, something I have a decent amount of training, well, an okay amount of graduate training in. If you're looking at Chinese history and you want to get a perspective on peasants, when you see a source from an aristocrat, the sort of things that they notice about peasant life are going to be very, very different from something that someone else might, or something that an outsider might. This is something that we get in Japan occasionally. Someone will crash on the islands or do a journey on the islands of Japan and provide outside perspectives on the daily lived experiences of Japanese people. And they're often starkly different from contemporary Japanese perspectives on themselves. And so always considering who wrote what kind of thing. Yes, you are a peasant, I guess, if you want to be. Anyway, who wrote what perspectives they have, what kind of things they notice rather than not notice. These are all things that are very commonly talked about in history. Now, standpoint theory, that's the kind of the basics of standpoint theory. This has been pushed to broader levels by certain academics. I don't think it was Patricia Hill Collins. I forget who. I don't know. Sure, I'll call on you in a moment. But one particular perspective on standpoint theory is that certain perspectives on things are privileged over others. And this is not something that's necessarily inherent in standpoint theory, but it is how it is often applied. And so the most famous example in Western academic discourse is when you're talking about perspectives on various things, economy, whatever, social status or whatever. When you're talking about slaves in the American sort of context, so I don't know, but pre-Civil War, obviously, they're going to have perspectives of living in the sort of African-American context of living as a slave, but they have to learn how to interact with people in this sort of white dominant culture as well. So they have to learn both sides of the equation. Whereas your average white person, I'm always talking about averages here. I want to make that clear again, just in case people are listening. I want to say I'm saying all Black people. No, averages. So your average Black person at this time period is also going to have to learn a lot about interacting with white culture as well. And because they have multiple sort of realms of knowledge, multiple cultural knowledges, they theoretically know their world better than people who only have one. I'm not subscribing to that. I want to make that clear as well. But I do think it is an interesting perspective to consider not just who knows what and what experiences they're coming from, but how they interact with their environment and what other cultures they must necessarily know. So especially when we hit the Edo, you see a lot of women who have to interact both at home and in the public sphere. And so you see a lot of, they have to interact with this very subjugated female sphere, especially at this time period. It's a lot nicer in some ways, a lot worse in others. But they also have to interact with the male sphere and understand that very well. Whereas male people, on average, at this time period, don't generally need to know anything about women's lives, unless they're an author. In which case, some people like Ihara Saikaku, who I mentioned earlier, excellent author, by the way, very interesting, learned a ton about women's lived experiences. And like I said, he's actually one of our big sources of how women lived at this time period, because he learned so much and wrote so much about it. But exceptions, not rules. And so I'm not going to go as far as a lot of, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but more than a non-zero amount of people have. I don't fully believe in privileging knowledge, but I certainly believe that certain perspectives are going to provide you more valid information, or more likely to be accurate to what reality actually was. Because we can never actually see reality in historical context. We can only ever guess at it. Unless there's archaeological evidence, and even then, it depends on how good it is. But when we're reconstructing an environment, there are going to be some perspectives that are more useful than others at certain times, in certain contexts, and at reconstructing certain things within that culture. So that is where I think standpoint theory is very useful in history. Of course, we ought to be careful as well. Just one last thing, because when we identify standpoints, we can't do so strictly on contemporary perspectives and contemporary identities. Like I said, there's a big push right now to saying, was there a third gender conceived of commonly during the Edo? So when we think about perspectives and standpoints, especially when we're talking about non-modern sources, we're going to always have to question which standpoints existed and can we identify them? And that can be very tricky. All right, chrisiousity, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in my YouTube recommendations today, came up this 5 guys talking about feminism. That's what it was, talking about feminism. And you see this thumbnail that's just 5 men. And it's like, Happy Women's Day to me. So it was just, and I understand that, these are the same kind of guys that if I was like, oh, you need marital advice? Oh, I'll go call some priests and they can come over and tell you, and they can tell you about being married and raising your children. They would look at me as if I was the craziest person in the world. But the idea that maybe this is not going to be the most enlightening conversation when you've taken out it, when there's nobody who has, original knowledge or a stake in this. There's nobody who has any dog in the fight is just going to sit there and that's probably the wrong way to put it, but you know what I mean. Somebody who's, yeah. So it's just, it's sort of, it's become really amazing to me that people are still so unaware, I guess. But I guess that's just...
I mean, at the same time, there are, of course, exceptions. And I want to just clarify, yeah, there are going to be exceptions to that. If you have, for example, a podcast of, Blair White and what's her name, Shoe on Head, and, Christina Hoff Sommers, maybe, and, these sorts of people, you're going to have, I think, a little bit less of an enlightened conversation about feminism and feminisms than if you get, like, Garrett and people like that as well. So, I mean, there's going to be exceptions, but I think certainly on average, there's something to be said for that.
Well, and none of the people, I should have said, none of the people were feminists.
Oh, yeah,
so,
yeah.
I mean, you have to actually, there ought to be somebody who has engaged with feminism in a discussion about it. Otherwise, what are you doing? What are you even going to talk about?
Also, I think what you said was very compelling, that you saw this on International Women's Day. Like, if there's ever a day you should go out of your way to at least include some female voices, that's kind of the day you ought to do it. Like,
I don't know if they recorded it on today, but it just happened to come up in my recommendations, and I just had this moment of, I think YouTube is punking me, you know.
So before we go on, I just wanted to ask if Lara, her mic was off before, but are you on now? No, still can't hear you. Okay, right. Now, how are we doing for time, Horikawa?
Oh, I've got to go in about 20 minutes.
Okay. Well, I guess before, because we are getting, I guess, toward the last 20 minutes. So in terms of all the topics that you wanted to discuss and cover, is there anything that we haven't gotten to yet?
Oh, very probably, but that's quite all right. I mean, it's not all that important. Conversations evolve organically, of course. So, I mean, is there anything else that you would be interested in particular, or people who are watching, or other people who happen to be in the call? I'm fine with answering whatever.
Yeah, I guess I'll throw it over to Kevin to see if he has anything. And then also, Laura, if you open on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a blue dialogue box. You can drop, you're in the chat, never mind. Okay, Kevin, did you have anything you wanted to expand on or ask?
I'll be perfectly frank. I didn't expect to be called upon, so I've been mainly doodling over the face of a male anti-feminist for a thumbnail for a video. So I can't offer anything of any value whatsoever.
That's all right. You're just enjoying the very interesting conversation. So let me ask you this, Horikawa, where do you see, are you optimistic about the areas that you're studying in terms of women getting attention and intersectionality? Are you positive in terms of the future of your discipline?
Oh, absolutely. Like, there's a lot of resistance from sort of the old guard, but to be quite frank, the old guard's dying out. They're physically just dying. Like, occasionally I get emails from, people in my discipline, and I'll get emails from either history side, Japanese studies side, cultural studies, whatever. And they'll be like, we regret to inform you of the passing of so-and-so. And I was like, I don't mind that much, He said some pretty nasty things about, X, Y, and Z. So, right. Oftentimes these people will do some very interesting stuff. Wow. Some very rigorous scholarship. Often not terribly interesting, often treading old paths and retreading old paths, in my opinion. But if you look at any department right now, if you look at not necessarily who's getting hired, because that's a whole different thing, because then you have departments, coming down, and often this old guard is still there. So they're hiring people that are like-minded, that are also old. But if you look at the graduate students in any department, if you look at the new crop that's going to be coming in the next 20, 30 years, you see a really open mind towards a lot of different feminist methodologies, feminist approaches, and focusing on women's issues, gender, men and men's issues, and the history of performing gender, and all these sorts of things that kind of come out of, your sort of gender performativity mindset or perspective, that was very popular, and it remains very popular in a lot of gender studies things. So, and there's a big push among graduate students, and it depends on your department on whether or not this is accepted, but there's a big push for multidisciplinarianism among graduate students. They want to go and take history courses. They want to go and take economics courses. They want to go take political science, gender studies, social justice sort of courses, critical race theory, whatever. And they want to mash it together with their home discipline. And some departments are not happy with this. I've certainly been in departments. I've been in a bunch of different graduate schools now. I bounce all over the place. And I've been in some departments that were very, very opposed to that, and some that were very open. But wherever I've gone, and I have Ivy League experience. I used to be in the Ivy League, which is very conservative. I do not recommend the Ivy League. They do a lot of very rigorous but very boring research, in my opinion. Columbia's maybe a little bit better, but the big three, Harvard, Yale, and I've done a lot of state school stuff, but regardless of where you go, whether it's Ivy League, whether it's, Cal State, wherever, you see in the upcoming crop, I see a lot to be optimistic about. A lot of very new and exciting voices, a lot of really cool, and even if they're not interested in feminism or gender, a lot of really cool and new approaches to history that deal with multidisciplinarianism and bringing in things like politics and economy and political economies. And there's I think a lot to be excited about.
Oh, that's great. Well, that's a positive way to kind of conclude that bit. But of course, you know, you're here and you're sticking around for a while, but while it's we've got a moment, a pause here. First, let's try Laura one more time. Let's see if her sound works. No, we still can't hear you, my dear. All right, I'll keep texting you. We'll try to figure it out. But the man of the hour, now that Kevin Logan was the man of the last hour, we've got the man of this hour. Dr. Pete Bloom. Peter, how are you?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little bit, I can hear you just fine. It's a little bit crackly, but we'll see if we can work on that a little bit. But how are you doing? No, and now
it would appear his mic is muted.
Yeah, I think you muted yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Women are marching all over the world, and I can't even click a button correctly. So,
Hey, it's hard work. Honestly, I didn't know. I thought I was in the call, and I didn't know I hadn't clicked the join button yet. So I was very confused for a long time before the stream was started.
How many PhDs does it take to run a Google Hangout?
exactly.
The answer might surprise you.
Quite. Well, if it's okay, we'll transition a little bit because Pete's here for a window of time. He's got other commitments in his life, so I don't want to keep him too long, but it's really good to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so one
Great
of the reasons... Oh, go ahead. Yeah, no, you go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, we're just going to say go ahead back and forth for like 5 minutes. So it'll be really boring for the audience. Yeah. Right. So the reason I invited Pete on because he and I have very different takes, I think, on the resistance. And so I wanted to get his take on like the Women's March and what has come from that and what he sees that emerging out of and taking it forward. I probably will have a similar analysis, but I will have my own take. But before you give us your take on the resistance, Pete, can you tell us a little bit about your specialty areas, just really quick kind of an overview of your areas of interest in the things that you study?
Sure. So my kind of background is in political economy and political theory, and I have 3 kind of main areas of study. One is the relationship between political authoritarianism and the kind of global free market. The second is looking at the ways in which we can think about resistance as different forms of social organization. And kind of third is the kinds of sets of discourses and ways in which we can think about empowerment kind of away from traditional marketing capitalist paradigms. So those are kind of my 3 intersecting areas of study.
Yeah, great. So Pete, let's go back in time a little bit to just before the inauguration. And we, at that point, probably had a lot of people there was the potentiality for doing things. And I don't know if you would agree with me that the Women's March really created a moment in time where people who had common concerns realized that they weren't so alone. They came together. And this acknowledgement, this consciousness of how many people agreed with you and how many people had the same commitments was the springboard for what we see now as kind of emerged as the resistance.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that there's been a lot of discussion about how that particular moment was so kind of captivating for not just people in the United States, but the world. And you know, I don't want to say what a lot of people kind of have already said ad nauseum, which I think is very right and true, which was that it's very inspiring and it was something that really was motivating. I think what it also did was really kind of 2 important elements that I don't think has been discussed enough. One was a very strong discourse that is happening not just in the United States, but around the world, is that there's this notion of the real people. And the real people are kind of, you know, what is now, I think, kind of, unfortunately, this kind of white, male kind of sense, people left behind by globalization. And everyone else is either elitist or people who really shouldn't be taken seriously. And I think when all these women came out and said, we're not going to take this, and actually we are the people in many ways, I think this sent a strong message that there was a real, you know, sense in which they were not going to be forgotten, and they were not going to allow themselves to be dismissed and marginalized. And I think that's what happened a lot in the election. I mean, I think, and this will go to my second point, but regardless of how anyone felt about the different candidates, there was a real, I think, sense that we don't need to take seriously people's concerns if they aren't these types of people, right? And I think when they came out, they said, we're not going to be forgotten in this administration, and we're not going to allow ourselves not to be heard. And I think that was inspiring. I think the other part of it was that it really showed how broad the progressive movement was. And I think there's an attempt to categorize people. I mean, we've been friends for a very long time. I think it's very funny because if you ask us from a political science point of view, which you're much more political scientist than I am, we're pretty much on the same preferences. And yet we supported very different political candidates, and usually do. And the ways in which people then read that, I think, in the mainstream media, and oftentimes internalize that, is to begin this kind of sense of, well, if you support this type of candidate, or you support these things, or you think this is important, then you believe this. And I think all these people coming together, there was a real sense, particularly of women, to say, we're not going to allow other people to define us. And we're going to recognize that, we have a lot of not only common interests, but ability to speak to each other and to build a progressive movement. And I think that was really important, because we live in an age where it's very easy to categorize people and to say, these are your preferences. You like these types of bands, or you like these types of candidates, so you must support these types of things. And I think these types of things are figurative and literal spaces where people can come together and say, we're not going to allow you to define us. We're going to be able to define each other. And we're going to do that in collaboration and collectivity and creativity. So I think that was really incredible. And I think you saw that in terms of the mainstream media not being able to fully know how to cover this, because they wanted to put narratives on it, and there was no single narrative. There was just like it's an intersectional movement, it was an intersectional narrative. There was a lot of different voices. And there was also this really wonderful point, which is after, I would say, a year of people saying, if we disagree with each other, then we hate each other. People saying, we may have different experiences and we may have different views on things, but that doesn't mean I don't like you, or I don't respect you, or I don't think that your view is worthwhile to be part of the movement. And I think that was inspiring. And I think that's something that really has set an alternative tone for what is an increasingly antagonistic and dichotomized political space around the world. So it's, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was going to say that one of the things that people started to critique the march on, and I actually want to bring in chrisiousity and Laura, if her mic is working, because they were both there in DC, is the idea that there was no message, there was no point, there's no unified aim for the march. And my take was quite the opposite, which is everyone was coming together with their concerns and recognizing that other people, actually, I might be there with a sign about, let's say, reproductive freedom. That doesn't mean I don't care about paid parental leave, or making sure people have health care, or the environment, or refugee issues, or women in the developing world. I care about all those things. I just can only carry one sign at a time. And so I think that you're right. Your comment about the intersectionality of the movement gives it an amorphous quality that allows it to bend and shape itself to resist Trump in whatever form. It's because all of the issues that he's working on are actually things that we can react to. So if I can go to chrisiousity for your thoughts and reactions.
Yeah, I felt that there was a lot of people who sort of came out and said this was just a feel-good, fuzzy, warm and fuzzy thing. I felt like there was an actual sexism there, because when I was there, I didn't see people, snuggling each other. I saw people carrying signs about reproductive rights and indigenous rights, and people sort of marching in solidarity with very specific things. And, the fact that we weren't getting involved in fights and battles, or the things that they would be critical of us if we had gotten involved in more of that, should not be taken as, oh, these women, they just wanted to get together and make little hats and march around, silly women, I really felt that there was, from some people, that kind of narrative and that kind of dismissal because it was a women's march. And there was a lot of, I thought it was very positive that it was called the Women's March, that it was assertively something that had been planned and initiated and featured heavily women, you know, and that is okay. It can be a woman's march, and that doesn't have to mean that we're excluding trans people or we're excluding men, but we can sort of put ourselves forward and say, you know, we're here too. And so with this, all these narratives that are going on, like, oh, you left the white working men and that's why you didn't win, and oh, boo-hoo, you know, which I'm not even saying that there's no truth to that, or nothing, you know, that we shouldn't have been concerned about those sort of things, but implicit in that constant message is stop talking about women's stuff, stop talking about gay stuff, stop talking about Black stuff. You're taking away from the important message, you know, which is, I'm going to turn it off now because the kids. That was my take.
Sure, that's fine. So let's try Laura for maybe 5th time lucky. No, I think we're still no sound for you. Sorry, dear. Horikawa, were you able to participate in the march at all that day?
Yeah, I'm Maryland area, so I was around, you know, that sort of thing. One thing I was kind of interested in, just thinking about it, I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking in terms of politics and the difference between an intersectional movement, so a group of all of these sort of oppressed people kind of working together, and standard coalition building in parties, because these are both groups of people with not necessarily often terribly related things working together for a common cause. And so one thing I was kind of struck by just thinking about this is the strength of these sort of intersectional movements in terms of Women's March, Black Lives Matter protests, all this sort of thing. Because you've seen a lot of movements lately, at least I have, trying to split this intersectional coalition. You see people like Milo saying, take the T out of LGBT, this sort of thing. And yet none of them seem to have stuck. They always kind of concern me when they pop up, but it's a remarkably robust framework of opposition that we seem to have constructed here between all these sort of different groups that participate in the intersectional movement. I don't really have a question or anything. I just think it's kind of an interesting comment and something that might inspire people to think more positively about the future, potentially.
Yeah. I'm going to throw it back over to Pete to see if you have some comments and thoughts on that topic.
I do. I mean, I think the relationship between coalition building and intersectional movement is very important. I mean, historically, I think one of the key points that you see is the fact that when intersectional movements, even before they were called intersectional movements, come together in a common cause, a lot of it is coalition building and saying, you know, we may have our differences or we may be different here, but we have a common either enemy or a set of principles that really positively affect all of us. And I think, you know, in this respect, in the present era, and I think this goes towards the importance of, one of the importance of feminism is to say, feminism is and should be a women's-led movement. But it's not just something that affects women. I mean, it's about the ability to say all of us can be affected by oppression. All of us can be affected by problems of social repression. All of us can be shaped unfairly by our social environment in a way that, you know, we don't determine and we don't have the power to determine. And I think further to that, I do think that you're seeing coalition building on an institutional level where you're seeing people all across the country. And I think the Democratic Party at the local level is a key example of this, where people are saying, you know, regardless of what happened in the previous election, we want to start building institutions now, because if we believe in these values, then we have to start building that now. And we have these values that go beyond just identity, because our identities are key and they're important, but they're also connected. I mean, and if you're not free, then I'm not free. And I think that's a key thing that is happening. And I think that, you know, you are seeing a progressive coalition arising. And that's really going to be, I think, the turning point from, you know, resistance to revolution or resistance to power, you know, because it is a key part of saying we are now going to try to transform social, economic, and political relations. And that's what resistance is about. And so I think the movement from intersectionality and the respecting of intersectionality towards, coalition and the building of an important coalition with shared values. And the march today has been a key step forward in that direction. I mean, what has been great about it is that there has been a very clear call of values, and very obvious saying, we're anti-imperialist, which is a big thing for the United States to say, right? You have something that is largely still led in the West, and they're saying we're anti-imperialist. You're having people come out and say, we're against mass incarceration, and that these things are fundamental to our strike today. So I think these are serious ways in which you are seeing a movement building that, these resistance is part of a broader revolution. And,
Can I just,
I'm horribly enthusiastic, but I'm excited about it. Go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I was just going to interject on the point of being anti-imperialist. I think for a lot of people that's an absolutely steadfast thing, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But I do, and I don't want to disparage just Americans, because I'm sure it's true the world over. But if another, say, 9/11 style incident took place and another Iraq style invasion took place, whether that anti-imperialism would hold up from the wider, less ideologically committed individuals within this broad coalition, whether that would hold up, I'm not convinced.
I would, if I can, I mean, I think that's a good point, but I would say that one of the missing things that isn't talked about is that if you listen to Donald Trump's speeches, I mean, he appealed in large part because he was very saying to Americans, we have unnecessary wars that are too expensive, and we have people coming over dying for unnecessary reasons. Now, that's something that wasn't necessarily said largely within the broader kind of political discourse, but it was a key point. And when, they did a lot of discussions, that was very much like saying, why are we entangled in all these things? So I think you're right that there's always, and you see it now on both sides. I mean, I think fear is used as a way to say, let's contain this. But I do think that there's a broader section of people who are questioning, not just in America, but around the world, what our global relations are and who they serve and who they benefit. And the fact that, Obama's last thing he wanted to do in office was put forward TPP, and from all sides wasn't able to do it. I think is a clear example of this, that, there is. But I think you're right. I mean, these are always on a knife's edge. I mean, and how far and deep this goes, I think is a matter for building a movement around it and changing the debate.
On the issue of the movement, reflecting back now, I think it was really important that the woman in Hawaii who came up with the idea first wanted to call it like the Million Woman March. Mm-hmm. And she was, I think she's like a middle-class white lady living in Hawaii, and she didn't realize that there had already been a Million Woman March for African-American women. And so people started calling kind of her out on that, going, why would you use the same name if it's a different march? And so when she realized that the march was becoming so big, that the spontaneous nature of everyone going, all right, yeah, let's go to DC the day after the inauguration and do a protest march. When they handed it over to the team of experts who actually ended up organizing it and putting it on, it was, one, really important that it was for women from various backgrounds, and also that they had, from the start, a deliberately inclusive and intersectional and progressive a set of values that connected everything up. Now, Horikawa, I know you have to leave probably really quick, so before you do, just to give you the last word before you have a chance to leave, is there anything you want to react to in terms of your thoughts on the way that the march was organized and how that's set the tone for the movement?
I think it's heartening, because while I felt that the reaction to this sort of thing is maybe perhaps a little bit premature in terms of, I don't think we're at fascism yet, but we certainly have some warning signs that we should be very concerned about. But I see some people going a little bit full hog on that. But at the same time, when I've studied fascism and fascist movements, particularly in Japan, these things don't end well, so to speak. Most of the time they end with a foreign power coming in, taking over, and replacing a fascist system, which is rather difficult to do in the United States. So even if there's sort of an overreaction at times, and I'm not saying that the Women's March was, I want to be very clear about that. Women's March, I think, was very appropriate. The fact that there's so much energy and passion behind the Women's March and movements like this right now has me feeling better, because often in these early fascist states, you don't see massive protests, or if you do, they're much smaller. They're you don't see massive protests. You see maybe small little pockets. But we have a very robust resistance in place, so that if things get considerably worse, which I think is a distinct possibility, I think we've got the infrastructure involved to stop it before it gets to the place where it can't be stopped. And that's the point where I'm most concerned about. Because to the best of my knowledge, and I'm not an international scholar of fascism, to the best of my knowledge, the only fascist system that was overthrown from within was Italy. And that came with massive life loss. It was a brutal, brutal, bloody thing, and I never want to get there. And so the fact that we have all this energy in place, we have the infrastructure in place for resistance, as well as laws in the United States, the 4-year term for president, all this sort of stuff, makes me hopeful in a time when it's often a little bit difficult to get hope. And you see all this nasty stuff happening, especially to the trans community and Muslims, and it's just horrible. But seeing this energy is just nice and makes me less concerned about a possible fascist future, because I think we can prevent it with the people we have built in.
Yeah, I agree. So, Laura, I heard her. I'm going to
go ahead and go.
Okay, yes. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for being there, everyone.
See you later.
See ya.
So, Laura, I think we can hear you now. No, we can't. I heard your mic. It went off, and we're like, it's the worst thing ever. She's just in the chat.
I'll just what I was going to say then, before Carvalho left. I was going to add in one part of historical anal tangent from me, that being Spain as an example of a fascist regime overthrown from within.
Oh, there you
not
go.
Overthrown, but overcome, I suppose, would be a better word, but whatever.
All right. Noted.
To add on to her point she was making about people potentially going a little bit overboard with the idea of a fascist dictatorship or a fascist regime developing in America. I understand, and indeed I would probably put myself in the camp of those people, because the point that she made that it would be difficult for a foreign power to overthrow an American dictatorship, I think needs to be expanded upon to it would be impossible for a foreign power to invade and take over America, realistically speaking, without the destruction of humanity, basically. So we cannot afford for it to develop. So I'd rather have an overreaction to a minor threat. What would be a fucking utter disaster for humanity to develop.
Right. So Pete, a few more thoughts, like your reactions to how the movement has been evolving and changing, the debates that it's been taking up in the last couple of weeks. Are you surprised at the cohesion that they've been able to achieve?
Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. I mean, one, I really want to stress again what Kevin and Eric always said is that, this is a serious moment in quote unquote American history, but also perhaps, contemporary global history, in the sense that it's not, I mean, whether it's an overreaction or not, I mean, this is a serious change. And the difference between Trump and, let's say, a Clinton presidency is a difference of kind as opposed to degree. I mean, what you're seeing is a difference between oligarchy and authoritarian plutocracy, right? And right now, I think that before getting just to the movement, one of the things that's interesting is that it's not just that we have democratic parts of the United States that are against Trump or the administration. What you're also seeing is that at present, the broader, deeper state, which is like the CIA, the NSA, and largely the corporate interests, are still committed to a kind of fairly illiberal, liberal oligarchy democracy. But we'll see if, once that changes, then you're really going to be able to see a process in which, Trump or the kind of movement that supports Trump could coalesce into something that's more explicitly authoritarian. And I think you see a big movement towards that. And what I think is important about the resistance is that they're providing an alternative. They're saying, It's not either or, right? You don't have to have this type of government or that type of government. You could have a better government. And I think that's a really important thing that's happening. Do I think it's surprising in terms of the cohesion? I think that, I don't know if it's surprising, but it's excellent in terms of, it's heartening in terms of the fact that things are happening so quickly. I mean, I don't think anyone, it's March, and the amount of things that have happened in just the last month and a half, in terms of the irresponsibility, in terms of the outright lying, in terms of there's things that I think are really important that you can't overstate. I mean, there's an executive order right now in the United States that allows police officers to pretty much arbitrarily arrest people that they think are illegal immigrants. Now, that's not a gesture towards a police state. That is a police state. So what you're seeing here is, I think, a cohesion that's moving from resistance to revolution, exactly because these things are happening so fast. And since they're happening so fast, it's creating, I think, an equally fast progressive resistance. What this looks like in the future and whether it's just responsive, I think is going to be a key part. Because I think right now, and understandably, it's very responsive. It's saying, we're in a time of serious crisis. And this crisis is something that we have to continually respond to, right? So, I mean, you have to respond to the Muslim ban, right? You have to focus on that. You have to respond to the things. But at the same time, you have to start becoming proactive too. And I think that's what's happening as well, in terms of saying, we're not just responding, but we also have an alternative. And we have an alternative that is a better alternative. And I think this, International Day of Women Strike is a clear example of this, where, they're very clearly saying, not only are we not coming to work and we're showing how indispensable we are to the economy, but globally, we want a different world and we're willing to fight for it. And it's more than just saying we want Trump out of power or we want to stop global nativism. We actually want to construct a progressive type of society that is inclusive, tolerant, and empowering. So I do think that because things are happening so fast, you're actually getting a more rapid revolution, if you will. I don't know if revolution is the correct word, but transformational movement.
Within the country, yeah.
Absolutely. And not just in the country, I think in the world.
Yeah, it seems to spark something. Yeah. Sorry, I wanted to jump in because someone else has joined the call, and I wanted to just quickly say hello. We're going to be bringing in here Edzia, who's going to be talking about international human rights, and in particular women's human rights. You want to say hi really quick?
Hi.
It's good to see you.
Yeah. Hi, Pete. We haven't seen in a really long time.
Hello, hi, Edzia. How are you doing?
Good, thanks.
All right, so yeah, getting back to Pete's time, we're going to use that while he's here. In terms of the way going forward, now, what would you? There's a lot of things that this movement has been able to, like you said, it's been flexible enough to stop. There's the issues of the Muslim ban. There's various protests against bills going through. We've seen the ACA. It's coming fast and furious. Do you, as we're moving forward, the agenda that the Republicans are going to be setting out and the resistance and the counter narratives that are coming against them, what do you think are the unifying themes that progressives really need to keep as their touchstones if they want to see this movement continue going forward?
I think that there's three. I think one, freedom, and an expansive note of freedom. And I think that the more that the resistance can become the civil liberties party, and I think this might touch on Edzia's kind of points about human rights, but an expansive civil liberties, not just against government, but corporations. And I think questions that are happening around surveillance, the recent WikiLeaks about CIA technology and ability to snoop and these kind of things is going to be key. And I think if they, you have to have a dichotomy between a policing society and a free society, and a discussion of what that means in the 21st century. I think equality, and I think the Betty Davis thing was very interesting because this really became, beyond education, a question of equality and the fact that everyone has equal rights to kind of social goods and public goods, and we all should be in this together. And I think that notion of equality has, that was largely replaced by kind of market notions of meritocracy, and I think equality is coming back very strong, and I think equality has to be put forward. And again, a more robust notion of equality, one that isn't just economic but also social, and that's a key part. And I think the third part, and you're gonna have to, but I think being the innovative party, being the party that comes up with ideas. I mean, if I can say honestly, I think that most people are not so interested in kind of the big words of capitalism or socialism or whatever. They want solutions, but they don't just want solutions to problems. They want, better ideas for what a society can look like. And I think the party that can go from, or the resistance that can say, we have good ideas. And I think this starts at a lot of the local levels. Like, we tried a national basic income in this city, and it worked really, really well. We tried in this area, instead of, putting heroin addicts in jail, actually giving them a safe place to do heroin and then offering them treatment. And it worked really well. So I think the resistance as the place that comes up with experimental ideas and pointing a way forward towards a different type of future. If I can say the last quick thing, and then things, one of the outgoing interviews that Obama had that was, and he, it's so different. I mean, I had definite issues with Obama's presidency, but between what he was doing, what Trump is doing, is that he really recognized that there's going to be a serious tension in the fact that we are coming in a different economic paradigm, whether we like it or not. Automation is coming. Competitiveness and the ways in which we traditionally have an economy, we're not going to need labor as much as we did 20, 30 years ago. And I think, I think one of the reasons that Obama, without giving him too much credit, we can go different on this, is that he did see that, like, why put what would a New Deal in America at the beginning of his presidency would cost so much, upwards of $15 trillion, something of that. That's what some economists said. And it may be out of place in a generation. So the question is, and I think this is going to be the kind of forward-thinking thing, is what is an empowering economy? Are we simply going to have mass unemployment? Are we simply going to allow ourselves to be controlled by these kind of market forces? Or are we going to have a future that we're optimistic about? And I think that right now you have just, simplistic language. I mean, when you have someone like Trump saying things like, I'm going to win, I don't know exactly what he's going to win. And we have to be the party or the resistance that says, it's not about winning. It's about having an interesting future, about having optimism and not being scared that, having robots do work, for instance, is exciting because we can create the social infrastructure to do that, right? And I think the more that we're optimistic and excited, that this kind of discussion of I'm going to win, or God, like some of the things he says that are just so like shallow, are going to be seen as hollow. So, I mean, I think that is going to be a key part of it.
Right. Well, thanks for that, Pete. And I'm going to kind of switch over to Edzia now, if that's okay, but you're welcome to stay and of course jump in at any point. But first, before we start, Edzia, just one of those other people on the chat. So you don't have to go off of your mics here, but there's chrisiousity and there's Kevin. And I'm going to give Laura a try one more time. She's been playing with her settings. No, it's just not happening. All right. So Edzia, hello. You're here to talk about.
Hey,
you're here to talk about human rights, and especially why gendering human rights is an important tool, analytic tool for what you study and what you do. So can you tell us a little bit first about the field of human rights and what you study?
okay. I've been talking about human rights all day, so
You ran with blank,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, back into the game. Okay. So I study two broad areas. One obviously is the area with Kristi. Kristi and I work on the qualitative election study of Britain, which Kristi started, and I tagged along. And now that's kind of become my whole life. So in the election study of Britain, we look at political opinion and public attitudes, and we try and understand why people the way they do when it comes to political issues. My other hat is the human rights hat. And so when I look at human rights so far, I've been looking at why do states do what they do when it comes to human rights? That's really the question that I've been trying to answer and that I've been interested in. Moving forward, and I know that you probably don't want to hear this, but I'll say it anyway. Moving forward, I want to combine these two things and actually try and understand why do people think about human rights the way they do. And so use the same tools of the qualitative election study, but to understand human rights attitudes. But that's where I'm going in the future. Generally, so far, what I've been trying to understand is much more at a state level. So why do governments do what they do? Why do they say they do certain things? They do other things and so on. So it's really very much an international perspective, an international relations perspective. That's where I am.
Yeah. And so why is it important to bring, to do gendered analysis of human rights?
So I think it's important because of two reasons. One is because international relations has very much been a field. So international relations is the field that tries and understands what states do. And that's been a field that's really looked at things for a long time from a very particular perspective. And that's often by making the distinction between public and private. And so certain things have to do with the state and certain things have to do with governments and other things don't. Or at least that's the way that I've seen how international relations theories work. And often when when you make that kind of distinction between what's public and what's private, question comes up, who decides? Who decides what is in the public sphere and what is in the private sphere? And so certain things get lost or certain things get ignored or pushed to the side as being private. And so we really don't have to talk about it when it comes to state behavior. And that's essentially been the problem of a lot of international relations scholars and explanations. We try and understand, so when we are looking at state behavior, what should we be looking at? What should we be looking at when we try and understand what governments do? And so we try, for a long time, the focus has been, let's look at what states do, or let's look at what governments do in relation to each other. So whether they go to war, or how they treat each other, how they treat other citizens or their own citizens. We haven't really looked at why this is in the first place. So who decides what states look at? Who decides what the power structure is? Who decides what issues are important and what aren't for governments? We often take these things for granted, and a lot of international relations theories take these things for granted. And I think feminist theories question that. They question, why are things the way they are? Why are structures the way they are? Why are power relations the way they are? And so on. So it's very important to bring that questioning attitude to the world. And so I think in terms of gendering human rights, that's one of the reasons I would do that.
Right.
The other reason I would, sorry.
No, go ahead. You finish.
Oh, I was just going to say, the other reason that I would think that gender and human rights are important, and looking at human rights in particular from a gendered lens, is because when international law was made, international human rights law was made immediately after the Second World War, we had the same kind of approach to international law that we had to international relations. You have a group of men, usually men in the room. With human rights, you had a few more women, but generally international lawyers at that time were men. Representatives were men. And so you had a group of men in the room deciding, important to us, these are the norms that we believe in, and this is how we should move forward. And so the aspirational documents that were created immediately after the Second World War had the word equal, right? Or things like that. All men are created in the same dignity. Considering the notion of how that would read to somebody who's not a man. I mean, just simple things like the symbolic value of documents, the symbolic value of words by men. And so I think bringing that to the fore and questioning things in a particular way, and why we speak of in a particular way, and why we even ask certain questions and not others is important.
When I
Sorry,
meet
that was a
Thomas-
long spiel.
Yeah. When I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to compel him to include women in the sequel. Work.
Yeah, totally.
Right. So I'm going to give people a chance to think of some questions for Edzia if you want to. But Laura, we're going to try one more time. I think she switched to a mobile device. And your mic. Oh, your sound is down. Now try.
Yep. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yay! I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what's happening with my computer. Obviously, I'll need to go get it fixed. But anyway, this has been such an awesome, already conversation, and just to kind of just touch back on that,
Yeah,
women's.
actually, Laura, could you talk for at least 3 minutes because I need to go refresh my water. So you
Sure.
are running the show. Go.
Okay. And so I just want to talk about the Women's March, and it was interesting because you did have some of that dialogue that said, oh, well, there's no real point to it. There's no real, theme. And I think it goes to show that, as women, right, we are everywhere. So when it comes to refugees, when it comes to equal pay, when it comes to, feminism, and, when it comes to voting rights, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, I mean, women are touched, I feel like, in every single aspect and are involved in that. And so, for them to say that there wasn't a theme, I think that they were missing it. And I think that too, because the march was marketed so well, meaning that we had the marketing from, the pussy, the hat, and, the pink. And I think that they kind of saw that it was heavily marketed. So then I think they kind of then negatively turned towards that and put that in a negative way, as opposed to saying, hey, like, this is something symbolic for them. And instead of looking, to see what the hat was about, they kind of just said, well, oh, they just have these funny hats, as opposed to digging in and asking, well, why is that? And so that's why I feel a little bit, sad that people aren't, giving the movement, I think, the credit, and kind of dismissing, the big marketing push that was, the march. And for me, especially, I've been to, tons of protests, and I've been to, marches of all kinds and parades and whatnot. And I can tell you that my personal experience was that it was a caring environment. Like, it was a inclusive environment. I mean, people were sharing food, people were sharing blankets, people were sharing coats. Like, I was getting cold for a second, and someone said, like, here, like, put on my coat, like, you're right here. I mean, a complete stranger. And, to me, that symbolized like a safe place, for a complete and utter stranger to say, it has my cell phone in it, I think I have my car keys in there, but you know what, here's my jacket because you're cold, and let's enjoy this moment together. Like, to me, that was saying a lot. And the solidarity that I had, and people were commenting on all the different signs, and about how all those signs, talked about different things. And so we would say, like, oh my gosh, look at that sign, and oh, I agree with it. And then we would have a mini 3-minute conversation about, what that sign meant, and, how bad things are, or cite an article and say, oh, I read in the New York Times about this. And I mean, it was just so, I felt intellectual. It was, the conversations that were being had, the solidarity, and then after the march was over, we ended up going into Potbellies, and we sat with another 2 women that, were also complete strangers. We shared a table, and they were talking about how they were nursing students in North Carolina and came up, and literally were missing like a couple days of their like introduction to like nursing school. And they were like, we found that this was so important. And they said, we are going to take time away from nursing, and, in this very important class, because we think that this is just as important, because as healthcare providers, we understand women's reproductive rights. We understand, how healthcare is super important to women, and how oftentimes it's been a dangerous, situation for women oftentimes. And, it was just so wonderful to hear them, from the healthcare field. So.
Yeah, Thanks for that.
And I just want to say, you know, caring isn't weakness. People act as if caring is a fluffy, bad snowflake thing. Caring is strength. Caring is solidarity, and solidarity is strong.
Absolutely.
You know? Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's you're right, because that is how we change the world. That's how the fact that people cared and wanted something, you know, like loved life and loved the idea of a potential for people to live a better life so much that they struggled, so that, you know, the women in this hangout were educated. And some of us have, you know, and we can, and some of us are moms, and some of us aren't, and some of us may be moms one day. But, you know, it's not like we have freedom, we have more freedom to make choices. Although there was a speech given today by Anne Hathaway to the UN, and she mentioned unpaid parental leave and those issues. So, but actually before, Pete, I don't know how much longer you have. I'm going to get back to Edzia, but Pete, I want to ask you really quickly, because you mentioned the issue of automation, and it seemed, sorry, I had some feedback there from my own voice. Oh, I'm still getting, I'm going to have to mute you and then turn you back on when the question's done. So the question is, and then I'll turn your mic back on. One of the patterns that I've noticed in subsequent, you know, in the recent past, let's say in the last year and a half, and especially now with the Trump administration, is the extent to which corporations are actually taking on a very serious political role. And as it's probably, you know, it could use the example of the trans bathroom issue. We could look at the Uber driver issue and how Uber was socially shamed and went back on it. We can see companies like Apple and the tech industry working against the travel ban. And so I wanted your thoughts a little bit on this notion of corporate political activism, which is something that I don't think corporations have really done so much in the past. At least, probably, I want to say they interfered in foreign countries' policies, you know, since globalization. But in terms of taking up specifically political positions in order to advance a progressive agenda, what are your thoughts on that? And Mike is going on.
Sure. Well, I think that in terms of that, it's a really important step. And it's an important step because corporations did not do that simply because of the fact that they are these, you know, altruistic places, institutions that really care about necessarily these issues. And even if they do, that is not the motivation. They did it largely because of the fact that there was a movement that was demanding that. And I think that this is a key point. I mean, one of the strong kind of myths that we have is that you have this global free market and there's very little you can do to resist it. And I think one of the reasons that you did see a Trump victory was that, and something like Brexit, for instance, in the UK, is the fact that there was these people who were saying, I don't necessarily know or support what they're saying, but at least they're saying that we can do something about this. And I think this is an alternative way of looking at it, in which we're saying you have these huge protests coming and saying, you know, if you want our business, if you want to continue to be profitable, you're going to have to recognize that, you know, these are our values and they're progressive. I think corporations can play for, you know, in the medium term, a strong role in kind of saying there are certain limits in which we're not going to cross. And I think that you do have to separate in many ways. On the one hand, like, do we want corporations overall as part of our future economy? Do they serve an important purpose? And I would say, I mean, this is perhaps for a different discussion. No, I think that they are not a positive economic influence. But we're not just living in the future. We're living in the present. And that's a key part of the movement, to be able to recognize that these are two elements. So it's like, you know, you have to recognize how you can use these to your advantage, but also recognize that they are corporate activism, but they are still being people-led. They are doing it because they are responding to a progressive mood, and people are laying down limits as to what they think is acceptable. So there's, you know, there's a market to going against the Muslim ban because so many people were outraged. And so many people were saying, you know, if you support this, we don't support you. And I think that's a really nice barometer of, you know, kind of recognizing that it's not just the right wing and it's not just corporations and it's not just elites who get to draw these limits, but that popular action can still kind of set the tone for what is acceptable and not acceptable. So I think in the short term, corporate activism can be quite important. But in the long term, it's it's what we want. That is an ongoing, I think, progressive discussion that we have to have.
Right. Yes. Okay. So thanks for that. Wait, mic's going off. Okay. So yeah, before you headed out, I wanted to make sure to get that question because it's actually something I've been thinking about asking you for weeks now, and I haven't had time to like type all that out. So getting back to Itzia. Sorry, what was
because
that?
I mean, can I just add to that? Because Pete's kind of talking about an issue that I know Sam and I, my husband and I, have been talking about as well, because Sam does business ethics as well. And so this issue of corporate activism, particularly in relation to human rights, that's been going on for a long time, hasn't it? I mean, with the fair trade movement and the whole issue related to, does that work, or is that just become like a brand in itself? Corporations do whatever they want, that fair trade banner, and then they can use that as a way of distinguishing themselves from so-called unethical. But when you kind of dig deeper, it really doesn't make any difference, because the unethical and so-called ethical brands actually do the same thing. It's just that they have managed to get a branding. So I think there has been a lot of thought in terms of the perils and the strengths of corporate activism in that sense, particularly with human rights and the fair trade movement. So I think I agree with Pete in terms of there is a lot of scope, but I think there's also, I think we have to be a little cautious in terms of just jumping on it and saying, yeah, this is definitely what we need to do, because another tool that gets co-opted by corporations, and then it doesn't make any difference. Then it just becomes another tool in their arsenal. Change.
Right. Just so you know, you're lagged a little bit. So I don't know if you want to just turn off your camera, or you can leave it on. That's fine. You can be lagged.
I'll reduce.
Yeah, so it might be a bit better. So one thing that I did want to talk to you about, Itzia, was on the issue of gendered human rights. There's a study that I've been trying to, been in my like video to-do list for ages. And it was actually by Plumper and Troga, and maybe one other co-author, but they reviewed the data about mortality in wars. And what they found was that within these sort of specific armed conflicts that they looked at in the recent past, that women were just as likely to die during war as men, and if not slightly more so. And the reason that they published it was because they're saying, when we think of armed conflicts, we tend to think of it in terms of soldiers and armies, and maybe we think about child soldier problems and that kind of dimension of it. But when we think of who dies in wars, we tend to always frame it in terms of soldiers who are disproportionately male. But the impact of armed conflicts like civil wars or other kinds of territorial disputes, you can read the paper. I can maybe put a link up for it later. But things like starvation and disease and refugee status, being on the road, maternal mortality rates, these things go up because the healthcare system is disrupted. And so really, when you total it all up in the time periods, men and women's deaths were a lot more on par. And that seemed to me like an example of how taking a gendered lens at an international event, something like war crimes, and thinking about how it impacts people differently and their lived experiences. And then if you're not aware of those problems, you can't provide services to address them, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just laughing because when you said, men and women die in the same way, I'm like, of course they do. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just one of those things where, once you kind of see the light, then it's difficult to see it from the other side. Yeah, it's difficult to see it from when you kind of have that perspective. No, I mean, the fact that Plumper and Troger have done a statistical analysis, which I presume that's what it is, makes sense. But even if you look at other disciplines outside political science, I mean, the idea that war involves just men dying in a particular way narrow-minded. It seems a bit blinkered. I mean, war affects people in a whole load of ways. I mean, this is just like kind of saying the obvious. But in terms of identifying how different things affect people differently. So what I think there are differences in how war affects men and women, particularly given the roles that men and women have to play in or in a local economy or in their villages or so on. I think the gendered roles affects men and women differently. And one of the areas where this is a major problem and where there's a lot of controversy and also a lot of concern is about conscription of children. And, you know, so child soldiers in or in rebel armies. And there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about how should we understand child soldiers and how should we look at gender or gender roles that child soldiers are placed in. Because oftentimes when we think of child soldiers, the mind immediately goes to, okay, boys will be conscripted into in the armed forces, and girls will be used to do those gendered roles, so taking care of cooking and cleaning and taking care of the army and so on. And obviously, in reality, it's no such thing. In reality, you have those gendered roles merging, and you have sexually abused and who are treated as wives, and you have girls who are conscripted to fight. I think bringing that kind of lens to certain issues within a much broader context of war is important, because I think war affects precisely because of the gendered roles that they have to play, and sometimes despite that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and that's why it is important to have a gendered lens of analysis that you can pick up and apply. Just like it might be also issues of race or ethnicity, or age issues, or it's an honor culture versus a shame culture. These are all ways to help us better understand what's going on. And so, yeah, I think are there any other examples? Because I know that it seems to you obvious, that women and men die in civil, armed conflicts at the same rate. Some people would, because you're right, they assume the men are soldiers and they go off to war. But of course, not all the wars that people go off to are other places where other people live. So, it's not always you're sending the men off. Sometimes it's people coming and invading your countries. But are there other places?
The idea that men go off to war and fight is an assumption. I mean, there's enough evidence all over the world and conflicts all over the world that men and women in many rebel armies in particular are equally likely to fight. In many cases, you would have women battalions in rebel armies that fight. So the idea that it is just men who go off to war, I think, is also a misnomer. I mean, is it a misnomer? It's wrong. It's an assumption that is not behind, there's no evidence behind it. Yes, probably in official armies, so state armies, yes, you would have men more likely to be drafted into a state army than women, but certainly not in rebel armies.
I'm going to ask if anyone has questions for Edzia. If you do, I don't know if you want to, someone wants to be bold and take the lead. Otherwise, you can think of a question, because I'm going to ask her. When you teach your subject, are there any things about gendered perspectives that your students find surprising or have found surprising in the past? That, again, that's sort of like you see it because you've been in the world and you're an expert in it, and then you're sort of met with popular understandings and popular views of things.
Oh, God, where do I start? So I just mentioned something that happened to me last week. Was it last week? No, it happened to me on Tuesday. No, it happened to me last week. I had a student, we were discussing human rights advocacy, and I had a student who basically said it out, that he didn't think that 2017 should be 17, we should be even discussing gender and women's rights, because the idea that women are victims is made up, and it's made up by a discourse that surrounds them, and they buy into it, and so they treat themselves as victims, and in fact they aren't victims, and we should stop treating them as such. And that the idea that in 2017 women are being persecuted in any way. And so this is one of my students who said it. And luckily for him, we weren't talking about gender and human rights, because I probably wouldn't have been able to stop ranting at him. So I kind of said, right, we are not going down that route. I disagree with you, but let's move on. I mean, I think it's shocking me how much we are going back to a time that I thought didn't exist anymore. You know, that a student who's taking a human rights class can say that in a human rights class, in a class that is almost completely female, with a female lecturer, and completely sure that he's right.
Some of that male privilege going around. So Pete
he doesn't even recognize it. I mean, yeah, where do you start?
Yeah, Pete had a question for you, Vitzia. But I might have to turn on his mic because he had some bad background stuff. So go ahead, Pete. Go ahead, Pete.
Sorry, so I had a question, Vitzia, that I've been thinking about quite a bit. And I think it touches on something that Laura, and if I mispronounce your avatar, chrisiousity, touched on about caring and the movement of solidarity and that ethics that emerged. And one of the things that I thought was really important here, that, you know, this does feel like a moment in which not only in terms of the differences that, you know, you have between gender, between men and women, but actually in terms of how we think about patriarchy and gender that affects both men and women oftentimes, if not equally, but has a universal effect. So, I mean, I can say caring. I mean, for instance, to give you a quick example, I think as I just recently was made head of my department at my university, and I can definitely say that I think
congratulations.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I was a pioneering and inexperienced white man falling upwards. Never happened before. But you know, I definitely can say from personal experience that sometimes I think it's easier for white males to be caring than it is for some of my female colleagues, because I don't have those expectations of people saying that if I am caring, that all of a sudden I'm not a serious academic or I'm not serious. And I was thinking about, you know, in my kind of historical studies, I mean, you know, when you look at some of the revolutionary movements, like the Bolsheviks, for instance, and I know that sounds a long time ago, but, you know, one of the reasons that there was such a strong authoritarianism is that they had an authoritarian patriarchal culture. They were very macho. And there was an idea that, you know, there was an allowance for vulnerability or discussion. It was very, you're right, I'm wrong. And it mirrors a lot of this kind of discussion of winning. And if you look at decolonization movements, you mentioned at the end of the Second World War, but even in the 50s and 60s, almost all the legal language focused on sovereignty, right? And focused on this idea of self-determination and these things. And I'm wondering, because I'm not a human rights expert or a legal expert, I mean, I kind of study discourses and political movements, but is this also an opportunity for us to begin thinking about how we rewrite the language of law, particularly international law and human rights, not just around how they, you know, have a gender perspective, but actually a non-patriarchal perspective? Like, what would a non-patriarchal human rights look like? How do we change the language of human rights so that it moves away from some of these kind of things of it's kind of very formalized, and I would say patriarchal rights, to something that encompasses formally ideas of caring and the right to caring, the right to be vulnerable, and the right to, you know, have a more empowering society and these kind of things. I mean, I'm not a legal expert in that, but I would be very interested in, like, do you think this is an opportunity for us to begin having those conversations and changing the very vocabulary of law to be less patriarchal?
I definitely think that is a moment, as you said. I think in the 80s, there was another such moment. So moment when we were talking about the right to development. And that was a moment when you were kind of trying to expand what law meant from individual rights, right? So the way that we understand human rights in international law today, generally speaking, is about you as an individual and the rights that you enjoy and the rights that you claim, and nobody else can claim them on your behalf. you then have problems about children's rights and rights of people that cannot express themselves for whatever reason, or you know, the problem of agency, expressing agency. 80s, then you had the notion of development and how, you know, what would rights look like if they weren't individual? What would rights look like if they weren't necessarily claim rights, rights that you could claim from a particular individual, but rights that you would still enjoy? So that was the whole, you know, in the 80s, with particularly with the right to development, but a lot of other solidarity rights, as we call them. So the rights of indigenous peoples, collective rights, group rights. You know, there was a lot done there. Partly because it's difficult to have a structure that works in a particular way and then add on an appendage that doesn't work in that way and work together. You know, so I think there was this attempt in the 80s to try and change how human rights are understood and how they are practiced. And to a large extent, it didn't work. The structure stayed as it is. You know, the vast majority of international human rights and international law that we understand and practice that have to function in a particular way. And so adding on an appendage doesn't work. So I think, yes, it is a moment for us to rethink what rights are, how they can be enjoyed, how they need to be protected. But I think if we needed to do that, then we would probably have to learn from the 80s, change the structure from the ground up. And I don't think that there is a will to do that, because I think there's a lot of investment already in what exists. And so I don't think people would want to throw out the baby with the bathwater kind of thing.
If I could just jump in.
Please, I was going to ask someone to.
Okay. So in the 80s was when I was involved in being a nursing assistant, you know, and then I sort of went into working with people with various disabilities, cognitive disabilities in particular. And so that very much ties in with what I saw. You know, I saw this transition from when I first started working in these kinds of places. If a person had, say, an emotional reaction to something, they could very easily just be tied up in the nursing home. That's just what you would do. You would restrain them, you would tie them up. There was no sort of overseeing of that. It just happened, you know. So those sorts of things, and I was probably like 19 at the time, just went on. And so as I went on, you know, you saw all of a sudden, even though maybe this person has a cognitive disability where they can't communicate verbally, but that doesn't mean, you know, that they don't have agency. And there was this really difficult, I want to say, transitional period with people who, for instance, I'm just thinking of something that happened, to give an example. A woman who was a nurse's aide. Yep, hang on, have a cookie. Sorry. So the thing I have learned about women striking is they can't. So
Moms can never go on strike.
No. But I remember there was a woman, she was, you know, a perfectly nice woman, but she was someone who was very care-based. So she had a person who had a disability who couldn't speak, and, you know, he sort of was giving the no sign as she was trying to give him and help him with a drink. So she held him down and forced it in, you know. So, and of course this became kind of an explosion within the whole company that I worked in at the time and in the nursing home, because maybe 2 years ago that would have been fine. She would never have gotten in trouble for that. but now it was, you know, seen in an entirely different way. So just the things, I think that when you look at how we conceive of human rights and agency and who has them and who advocates for them and what the proper role of an advocate is and where that role should stop, you know, as well, I think that you really, it's just like you said, it's tagging on something to a system that doesn't work. Because in a system where a person can be considered, can go to a court and get a designation of just not competent to make decisions, and then from then on in, you know, that's it, done, they're gone. You know, I mean, they have other people making all their decisions for them, and there's not a proper oversight. And even when people try to oversee it, it is very difficult, because it's like working in a hole. It is that sort of square peg round hole kind of thing, where you're just not getting, it just doesn't work. So just thought I'd throw those out there.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, by the way, I see, I'm going to turn off your mic, or turn off your muted mic unless you do it. Pete is heading out shortly, so I will just wave goodbye because there's a lot of background. So you're welcome to stay for as long as you can. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, for letting me be part of the discussion, and this is I have a 2-week-old baby, so I have to go make dinner. But this has been such a great discussion, and these are the kind of things that, you know, in a time that's really difficult, I think, the future. So thank you.
Thanks for coming, Pete.
And to kind of,
Pete.
Yeah, thanks. And hopefully, if I can join back on later, I'll try. But thank you, everyone, for letting me join. Bye.
Okay, bye. And Michael Rollins is here. He's joining us. I see if I can give him a few seconds. Maybe he walked away from his. Oh, there you are.
Hello. Hello. What's going on?
Well, what's going on is we're officially entering the chill part of the night. So we still have
baby.
We have Adzia who's still here, but when Michael entered the room, it became the chill part of the night.
Man, I was thinking, shit, this is too much academic for me. I was like, holy crap, there's no way I can add anything of value to this discussion.
Well, we're going to go lowbrow really soon here. And actually, speaking of that, I'm going to turn my camera off because I've been on camera like since 7 now, and I'm tired of being on camera. So I'm going to just become my icon. You can watch the previous 2 hours if you haven't gotten enough of me. I turned my mic off, not my camera. All right, there we go. Yeah. So and Laura too. I brought you up now too, so that because you had some background noise before, but you can go ahead and jump in at any time.
Well, I wanted to ask, is it Adzia, right? Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah.
Adzia. I wanted to ask her, so that student that came up to her that was very confident, that asked, well, why are we still talking about, women's rights at this, at this point in time? Like where do you think, where was he from? What was his kind of, cultural influence? Like, what was his, environment like at home? Because I think that we need to understand people like him in order to, have, perceive this movement, make connections with people, conversate with people. So I'm just curious to know kind of what your assessment was of and the truth and his, where he came from. If we could just touch upon that, that would be great.
Can I just interrupt really quickly? First is, I think, Adzia, for Michael's purposes, for his benefit, could you just restate your experience? And then
I heard it.
And then when you've recounted it and you've given your answer, I think a lot of the YouTubers will want to jump in and explain exactly where he got those ideas.
So, Michael, just quickly, I'll let you know, I study human rights and public opinion, really. So those are the two hats that I wear. And so far, I've been working on why do states or why do governments do what they do when it comes to human rights. In terms of that student, I didn't, at the time that he spoke, I didn't know his background at all. All I know is that from his accent that he's from Northern Ireland. That's it, right? I don't know anything else. I have since spoken to and have found out a little bit more. So he's a unionist. I don't know if that makes any sense to anyone, but he comes from a very conservative, pro union background. Kevin's kind of going, yeah. Kevin's reacting to it.
Could you restate what happened in the class, though? What the exchange was and what his surprise was at?
Okay. I'm just trying to remember. So many classes since then.
This was the kid who came in and he didn't think women were victims. It was just a narrative.
I'm just trying to remember the context for the discussion, and I can't remember what the context was. But I think it was some kind of an example that I had told them to discuss. And then in the context of that, we were talking about, and then I think he kind of decided that he would lay this out there. So if I remember the details of the context, I'll mention it, but I can't remember it right now. Since then, I found out that he does come from a very conservative background. He comes from a unionist family. He has very strong unionist views, and I found this out from the lecturer who taught him on the Northern Ireland politics module, who's also from Northern Ireland, and so he has a better sense of the politics of the place. And I have also since found out
what he actually said was.
What he actually said was he didn't think that we should be discussing women's marginalization, but that's my word, that the problems that women have or treating them as victims in 2017 because it's 2017. Women don't have these kinds of problems, and the reason that they think that they do is because of the discourse that surrounds them, and so they treat themselves as victims and others treat them as victims. And there is essentially what he was saying is that there really is no evidence to suggest that women are victims or that they should be treated as if they are facing problems and so on. So the notion of
I find that remarkable.
Yeah.
Oh, we're getting feedback.
I think maybe Edzia has to mute herself. I got her.
Someone from Northern Ireland would make that point, considering Northern Ireland is the only place in Britain that, or in the UK, I should say, UK, that doesn't allow abortion. It's still outlawed in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, there's a basic.
As indeed is gay marriage, so lesbians are put upon quite badly there as well.
Yeah, but that discourse, the idea that women, not women, feminists, and whether they be men or women, but especially feminist women, are committed to a victim narrative because they want special treatment, when really they're just already being treated equally and it's not good enough for them. And so that they, we, I guess, complain about things so for the sake of complaining about it. And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there is that battery that I mentioned. I saw, I think it was in Vox, where they had talked about two new ways of measuring sexism, and one of the more misogynistic forms of sexism was that women just complain about things that they shouldn't complain about. It was to that effect. So yeah, Michael.
I was watching Kevin's video yesterday about the Sarkeesian effect, and there was a bit in that which was about Sargon of Akkad and his writing about Anita Sarkeesian and her harassment and all that sort of business. And he basically said that that she was continuing to complain about the well, that's the thing. He didn't say harassment. He said the questions that people are posing to her about her work. Yeah, her criticism in big, huge earmarks. that she was continuing to talk about this thing, so to perpetuate her victimhood, which would then lead to people giving her more money. So because what had happened, if you don't know, what she set out this little goal on a Kickstarter, a modest goal, and it basically blew up. It was like $6,000, and it blew up to like 150 grand or something, because she got so much attention because people were harassing the shit out of her online, right? And so these guys have spun it to she's playing the victim just so that she can get money out of people. And I was like, you fucking kidding me? And the ignoring of the actual the fact that she is actually a victim, a person who has been targeted by online harassment and doxing and death threats and rape threats and all that sort of business. That is like trivialized and even ignored, so that they can then say that she's just playing the victim. And I was like, you thought what? it's ridiculous. It's very, very bizarre.
I always enjoy listening to people. When I say enjoy, I'm amused by listening to idiots going about how female entitlement complexes, coming from the very people who literally spend their entire time telling women what they can and can't complain about.
Right.
That's always fun.
And also being like completely entitled, like all the time when it comes to like their platforms and things like that, just having this ridiculous entitlement complex to,
that women are playing the victim or whatever. When if you go through the International Women's Day hashtag on Twitter, some of the men complaining are just ludicrous. Play the victim or what? Oh no, there's focus on someone other than me for one day of the year. No.
The whole thing of people or men coming along when you talk about International Women's Day and then a man coming along and being like, oh, why isn't there an International Man's Day? I thought that was like a kind of just a myth that never happened, but it totally happened to me last night. Like I put up a tweet about International Women's Day, and some guy came along and said, why isn't there an International Man's Day?
And there is.
It is. That was it was like a dream come true that happened to me.
The number of times, the number of times these people could get an answer if they just typed it into Google instead of asking people on Twitter. I'm sorry, Kevin, I had to make that joke, and it's International Women's Day, so I just plowed right through. Go ahead.
How dare you speak over a man on such a day? It's disgraceful. I was just going to say. That it not only is it obviously pathetically childish one-upsmanship, but it backfires because you can just say it's on November the 19th, and there's also a great graph I saw on Facebook of the relative spike in people searching for terms on Google, and the one for International Men's Day is tiny, the one for International Women's Day is enormous. So clearly these men that are complaining aren't searching for it and aren't fucking interested in it. They don't give a fuck about International Men's Day. They just care about shitting on International Women's Day.
About a gotcha, yeah.
Well,
I gotcha.
I don't think anybody would know that there's an International Men's Day if there wasn't an International Women's Day to get the word out.
Oh, that's great.
Isn't that the classic definition of narcissism, though? About like making someone else's like issues like somehow owning them and making them about you. Like, isn't that a classic like narcissistic way?
That's exactly what the anti-feminist movement is.
Right.
It's just a whole bunch of fucking narcissists.
I mean, because and that's the thing, and it's interesting because I online. I mean, there's tons of people online that are trolls that are just looking kind of to instigate, right, and to aggravate. And part of it was one of my friends. She lives in Minnesota, and she posted that that funding was to be cut from I guess abortion providers and certain healthcare centers. And so then a guy immediately went on there and said, well, yeah, I mean, like we wouldn't like birth control isn't that expensive, and this was white male. And birth control isn't that expensive, and why don't you just like not have sex? And it was just like, I mean, and you're just thinking like, how in the heck? And this is some 20-something-year-old, and it's not to make light of it, but I was just so frustrated that all I could do right at that moment was just be like, you know what? I'm very sorry about your tiny penis. No, I did. And I said, I'm sure you're getting all the ladies, right? Because everybody wants to line up and get plenty of birth control. I said, when they interact with you. I mean, it was clear. I mean, I'm not being intellectual at all. Like, I was trying to be mean. And he literally was like 20 comments later, he was like, I'm about to send you a dick pic so that way you can see how large my manhood is. And it was just literally like insane about how he went so far to like try to prove me wrong that he didn't have a small penis, that I was like, you know what, bro, thank you for proving my point exactly on here. Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of points quickly. Firstly, how fragile does your masculinity have to be baited into a dick pic that I mean, not just that, but that could be a picture of any penis. That's not proof, unless you've also got your face and a copy of today's newspaper in that picture as well.
His driver's license. You could put it on his thigh.
I mean, literally, I was just like, I can't take it anymore. And like, I ended up dead because, because that's the thing is these things can escalate pretty quickly. And so then at a point, then I was just like, okay, I just need to block this guy. But I did report him because, he is essentially one of those people that I could think would be like, okay, well, you know what, you deserve rape and go there. And so I was like, you know what, I don't want it to go there, but I feel like this is somebody who can be baited that way. And like, and he could say something like that. So,
yeah, and not just that, but these people, the obvious point, or not necessarily obvious point, but the obvious joke to always make with them is that their personality alone is more than enough in terms of contraception because they're never getting laid.
And again, with guys who can basically walk into 24-hour, usually if you're depending on where you're living, or at least 18 hours a day, walk into any kind of shop and buy a condom for literally not that much money, whereas women have to get we have to get prescriptions. We have to be on the pill for at least 7 days before it's effective, or we have to have things inserted into our body, or we have to have patches that sit on our skins for so many hours a day. It's the complexity of controlling our fertility is something that I don't think men know. I mean, they're aware of it, especially if they don't want you to get pregnant right now. They know it's a thing, but they don't know all the things involved with making sure that there isn't a baby when there isn't one, when you're not ready for one. By the way, before we go on, I'm just going to say we're now moving into the free-for-all, totally chilled out part of the night. I don't have that. I didn't get around to doing the lightning round questions video yesterday because I was just tired. And so, yeah, but I have some topics we can discuss, but I also thought we could just let the conversation evolve a little organically, except instead of it being my usual crowd, my, chrisiousity, Kevin, Michael, I now get Laura and Zia in it too. So it's like more friends. So it's Kristi's happy night. So yeah, we can go back to the conversation, but I just want to say there's no rules now. Anyone can bring up any topic. And also women should feel free to jump in over the men, because we tend to, good. If you have something to say, just push yourself forward until someone makes a pause.
Well, no, Kristi, but I took it to heart because I immediately went to the dick pic.
Yes. There you go.
Well, I wanted to actually bring up because, what most of us do is argue with chuckleheads online. So I'm going to apologize ahead of time to Zia that this will probably come up more than once. But just going back, to me, even more than the narcissism, what I get a lot is just entitlement from a lot of the people that I argue with. The incredible idea that somebody who's a complete stranger to me can demand my attention, can demand I answer questions, can demand all these things. And when I, so I got to the point with this one person that, who's made just the most ridiculous arguments. The kind of arguments that we've all been in before, but it's going around in circles. It's going nowhere. And I'm saying, you know what? It's fine. You can either go and I can give you some places to go educate yourself or not, but you've sort of reached the limits of what I can do for you. And he's coming back, and he's coming back, and he's coming back. And then it's getting he's getting more sort of aggressive about it, right?
Mhm.
Yes, there are little people trolling me right now. They are also entitled, but they are too. So they have an excuse.
They have a right. Yeah, yeah. They have a reason.
Right. Well, and I mean, I think it's interesting. It's aggressiveness. I think
Yeah, it's a very
is
aggressive
something.
intent.
Right, precisely, and it's like there are differences between a man, and because I've had those conversations with them of wanting to understand and learn versus like that are defensive and like aggressive. Because you can't teach somebody anything, or somebody is going to have a hard time learning if they're defensive, if they don't feel quote unquote safe.
Right. And so what I had ended up sort of saying towards the end is I said, listen, you really need to learn how to have a woman say no to you and hear it and say that this is it, no. And so that then is when he comes back to me with, well, I see you found a way to make yourself a victim. No, honey, you couldn't victimize me with a tank. I'm telling you right now, this is not about me being a victim. This is about you being a, jerk. But at this point, you don't even say it. You just block him.
Right.
But he's going to go on to the next person.
I mean, if I can kind of jump in there, I don't think that this is I see a bit of this, at least in academia. I mean, I am a person, I'm not white, and I'm a woman, and I tend to be in positions of authority over students who are either white or not, but who often come from or seem to come from cultures or backgrounds where they are not used to being criticized by women. And I get this a lot from at least two of my PhD students who get extremely defensive and then they get aggressive because I have critiqued what they have written. Right? So I'm not criticizing them personally. I'm just having an intellectual discussion about what they have written. But they take it very personally.
Wow.
Personally, when it's my colleagues who happen to be white men say similar things. Often I will have a student, this actually happened this afternoon. I had a student who presented his work, and I asked him a question, and basically I told him, I don't think I didn't say it in these words, but I didn't think what he was doing was good enough or to that standard. And I asked him a question, and he got really quickly. And I had another colleague in the room who is a white man. Just following on from what I said, or what Edzia said, I would like to add to the comment. And the reaction was slightly muted to what he said. And obviously the student is not doing it consciously. But, you do pick up on these things, and it happens over and over and over again. It does happen a lot with my students. It doesn't happen with my colleagues, my students.
I think online, there's this whole thing coming from some of the quote unquote leaders of the quote unquote anti-feminist quote unquote movement, that of this kind of ponage culture, like owning people, of knowing that you're right, and just kind of yelling at people to and because you're right, and you think that the other the thing that you're opposing is just this ridiculous thing. And you see this when people use these kind of gotcha things all the time. I mean, it's going on in the chat at the moment. People are like, oh, you're just assuming my gender. Oh, mate, wasn't that a bit sexist, mate? Oh, pointing out, thinking that these things are completely ridiculous, and then going on and just kind of assuming that you're right and being very aggressive about it and just wanting to destroy another thing rather than having a productive conversation or trying to talk about the ideas or whatever. It's all about destroying the thing that
Yeah,
that
this
you know,
is the fundamental problem I have with this concept of the culture war. I'm sorry, you can't go from 1 second saying, "Oh, we want to have discussion. Why won't they talk to us?" to saying you're in a war with us. We're not going to talk to you if you're in a war with us, you fool. We're going to shell you.
yeah. And apparently
and
this oh no, go for it,
winning.
Laura.
Oh, sorry. So winning, right? Because it's like we always have to win, right? Because right now the narrative is somehow America isn't winning, and our military isn't winning. So I think it's they're listening to this illegitimate president, and they're saying like, oh, well, I'm just going to use his words because I mean he uses very basic terminology, very basic language, and I think that then rolls over. It's like, well, if he can use it, well, why can't I use that same terminology and that same mindset?
Yeah, bigly.
There's
Yeah.
also this thing that's apparently happening again soon called the triggering. Have you guys heard of the triggering?
Yeah, that's tomorrow, isn't it? I think.
Can you
Yeah.
just review what that is really quick for anyone who might not know?
As far as I understand, it's a bunch of assholes being assholes to other people for the sake of being assholes. Just being a dickhead and trying to quote unquote trigger other people.
Is this like the Purge but on Twitter?
Maybe. I suppose. Yeah, I suppose that's kind of what they're kind of copying. It's the idea, like the special snowflakes getting triggered all the time because I said some trigger words or whatever.
They're going to be horrendously offensive under the hashtag the triggering, and then complain when they get kicked out because they're obviously breaking the terms of service by being incredibly intentionally abusive to people en masse.
Yes. And it's like it's the intention of just being an asshole is like I don't understand. I don't get it.
I think it's just
Very odd.
laziness. Well, it's a very easy high. I kind of think the same way about people who go to church services in order to get stimulation. When they go there and they want to kind of be infused with the Holy Spirit and they go for like an emotional uplift. And I think that there's a gratification there that if you enjoy it, you go back for it again and again. And I think it's the same thing with trolling, is that it's like the bully mentality of, feeling like you have power over someone or you have one-upped somebody, because that's how you perceive your value, is by putting other people down. And then you just go back to that well. I mean, I'm speculating here, but from my experience, it just seems to be, like what chrisiousity was saying earlier about the person who just keeps making more demands and keeps retreating, and they don't want to put the work in to have the conversation. They want to watch you dance.
Yeah, I was watching a conversation between Tim Demotivator and Steve Shives just yesterday, and they were talking about how Steve's channel has kind of changed over the years, and his approach to criticizing religion, and Tim kind of made the point of, are you really going to change your mind if someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, you fucking idiot, stop being a fucking dipshit, you suck, you're bad and your ideas are bad, stop being wrong." You're not. That's not going to be something that's going to help change your mind or progress the discussion further. So Steve sort of said about how he's kind of changed his approach from this kind of ponage thing that we see a lot in guys like the Amazing Atheist or Thunderfoot or Sargon, to a more just discussing the ideas rather than just fucking
Also,
I think
it's
that's
interesting that they're that aggressive religious types, but also have now basically meant that you've got fundamentalist Christians in charge of the US government. So well done there.
Nice job.
Yeah, I have the atheist movement. As a secularist, I don't really identify as an atheist, but as a secularist, I couldn't be more annoyed with them right now. But right to your point, a friend of mine was being sort of harassed by an atheist. She's a Black woman who is also a Christian, and he called her retard, he called her this, he called her that, because she's a Christian. And so I sort of said, look, don't you guys ever want to get out of your demographic?
Yeah.
Don't you guys ever want to sort of expand your appeal? Like, do you really think this is the way to go about it? And of course, at that point, being that I was dealing with a skeptic, you know, I was made to prove that there was any kind of demographic disparity of white men in atheism. And when I, you know, presented the Pew data, that wasn't good enough, and I was an idiot. And when I presented something else that would back that up, well, I was still an idiot who didn't know how science worked.
Was it the Huffington Post?
No, it was actually the Atheist Alliance United or something had done some sort of study on people. Like, yes, Pew data statistical analysis doesn't uses only a small.
No, Logan.
Hang on, Devin. Hang on.
Moms can never go on strike. Moms are always at work.
Yep.
Devin. Hang on a second, sorry.
The experience of parents, I find, is a very, very good incentive for me to use protection.
Yeah, I have just before you speak, Laura, I have a friend who is known for saying kind of outrageous things, and she had a little video of her son, like basically saying oatmeal over and over for like 2 minutes, and I said yes, you know, and I slept until 11 o'clock, and her reply was, yeah, he is sort of a walking Durex ad, isn't he? And I said, but it's, you know, that's why it's a good thing he's so damn cute, and we agreed. But yes, that was, I thought was, you know, a mom kind of giving a moment of frustration, but not truth.
All right. Well, and I mean, and I got into a discussion. So, I mean, I grew up a staunch Catholic, you know, Catholic upbringing, you know, very religious family. My dad is a permanent deacon for the Catholic Church, but considering that we are a pretty progressive family. And so I got into a discussion with one of she actually was my kindergarten teacher back in the day. And she posted about how Pope Francis is basically saying, like, it doesn't matter, basically, like, what religion, or even if you're an atheist, so long as, right, you care for people and that you're giving to people, that you're a kind person. Because if you're like a greedy Christian, right, or a greedy Catholic, that's worse, right, than actually even not even believing in God. And so she posted that because it was, you know, kind of controversial, because she is a more progressive Catholic. And it was interesting how her brother-in-law and her sister were basically saying, well, the Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. And I'm like, how is it that, I'm like, you're cherry picking. I said, that's what you're doing. And I said, granted, I said, this is a new age. I said, this is a new Pope. But I said, you can't, you know, cherry pick these things, and you have to understand where he's trying to lead people and to try to be more inclusive, right? And to try to bring more people kind of into the circle. And it's not to say that Catholicism is right. And I think even Pope Francis even said it doesn't matter even what God you follow. And then they were like, well, you know, I was always taught that if I, you know, was a Catholic, went to church and you know, and did the right thing, and, you know, followed the 10 Commandments, that I was going to go to heaven. So why does he get to say now that any other religion is better than our own? And it was just kind of that realization where I was like, wow, like, people are not really open to even like a new Pope and to kind of his new message and what he's saying, because I think he is a pretty progressive Pope. I mean, granted, he still is the Pope, and he's still, you know, it's the Catholicism is a huge, you know, monstrosity of an institution. But you know, I mean, it said something to me that even with the leader, you know, the Pope saying these things, that it's very hard to even switch their minds, or to, you know, switch their level even a few degrees, right? A little bit of difference.
Yeah, I would say that. Oh, Coven, go ahead, and then I'll pitch something. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree with the general point you're making, but I find it difficult to take the Pope seriously when he lives in a massive mansion, going on about giving to the poor. And of course, the fact that the Catholic Church has tax-free billions that they're doing nothing of good with.
Yeah, that's true. You know, charity starts at home.
True.
Yeah, who's that?
Oh, no, that was me. I was just saying true. And it doesn't take away from, you know, I'm saying the monstrosity, right? That is the, you know, the Catholic Church and you know, and yeah, that you know, crazy amount of wealth, and you know, don't even get me started on the whole, you know, like pedophile thing with like the priests and everything that happened, because that to me, I mean, and being a Catholic, that was huge for me, and I stopped. I mean, not that I was a regular you know, goer of you know, Sunday mass, but you know, when those reports came out and everything was sort of coming to light, I mean, you know, I started to question a lot and say, you know, well, how is it that they allowed this? And it's not that God necessarily like allowed it, but it was these people that kept this under the rug and it kept it going. And so I was very angry at that. I'm still very angry at it. So yeah, I have a very interesting, I think, perspective, because on one way, I'm grateful, you know, having grown up that way, but at the same time, now as an adult, I get very angry at the institution a lot of the time. So I'm back and forth, hot and cold.
Yeah, tomorrow night I'm going to be on a hangout with Steve Shives and Eli Bosnick. I'm really, really looking forward to that. But one of the topics that I want to raise with Eli, because he's talked about it before, is he went from having a very sort of a polar opposite view to one of sort of progressive values and social justice. And it was over time that he changed his mind. And one of the things that I want to talk to him about is, you know, what kind of dialogues and conversations have to take place in order to get to a point where people can actually not necessarily even change their minds, but hear the other person and consider what they're saying seriously. And I get a lot of invitations so I'm going to kind of move into YouTube world now, because you know, these conversations are happening online, Facebook, Twitter, but YouTube is also one that stays for a long time. You can go watch videos from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So these conversations can have a really wide reach. And I get a lot of invitations to come on people's shows and debate them or talk about or defend feminism. And I generally turn them down because I don't feel that yet I've found an interlocutor who would actually hear me. You know, most of the times the people who send me these invitations are already done hate videos on me or videos critical of me. And so that obviously makes me immediately suspicious why they really want me on their channel. But, you know, I had a really good conversation about Islam and feminism with Deadhead Animations. We did a sort of like we watched some videos and spoke over them, you know, reaction video to them. And there was a back and forth, and he asked questions of me and I answered, and I asked questions of him and he answered, and there wasn't an agenda. You know, there wasn't a ponage goal there. It was actually just two people having a discussion. And I don't feel that I can't think of people in the YouTube community that I would feel comfortable having that kind of conversation with yet. I haven't met that anti-feminist or egalitarian, and I don't know how other people who do have channels feel about that. So chrisiousity, if the sound is okay, if things are calmed down, I don't know if you want to pick up on that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that last question?
Yeah, sure. Do you feel, are there YouTubers that you feel that you could go on their shows, do a live stream with them, and really have an open conversation who identify as anti-feminist and really not try to prove one another right so much as exchange understandings and perspectives?
Yeah, well, I went on the other day, No More Dogmas channel, which he and I have a good relationship. And we are, you know, it started out really well, but then other people wanted to come on. And once the other people came on, the whole thing went to pod, you know. And usually, because I do try to go on to these other people's channels, and some of them are just so painful. It's just really, it is the most absolutely, like, you know, you get into these conversations with people who are saying things like all of history is about gyno supremacy. Our entire history, we've been gyno supremacists. Everywhere. Like, we are now, we were then, just that's how it's always been. And how am I even supposed to have a conversation with you? Like, where am I even going to start with this? Like, it's just, you're not living in my reality. and I can't help you. So I try to change the subject to, well, all right, let's talk about maybe what we could do today in some very specific or narrow focus that would be helpful between, our groups. Because, I'm interested in certain meds issues as well, especially meds, suicide and drug addiction, which I think are really, they're just spiking, and they're spiking far too much, and something needs to be done. So I said, well, how about that? Well, you have to understand that the reason that men are killing themselves is because of gyno supremacy. It's like, yeah, okay,
You can't win.
I can't help you. So it's
I went on No More Dogma's channel as well. I've been on a couple of anti-feminist channels. I went on No More Dogmas with Tim, and he was great. He was really open to discussing stuff in a reasonable way. But there was a couple of other people that I wasn't so keen on. There was one guy that I just, oh god, he was obnoxious beyond belief. I just couldn't deal with him. He was he just don't get me started. So
you're so, I thought you were gonna like say a name or mention something, but you just kept going on about how terrible he was.
He was just so obnoxious, and like he kept saying things like, oh, are you even listening to the words that you're saying? And then he would go on and say all this other bullshit that made no sense, and I'm like, are you listening to the words that you're saying? I was trying to explain a bunch of stuff, like how ideas in popular culture could have influence on people, and things like that, and he was just, it was obnoxious. Anyway, so No More Dogma was great. I went on. I've been on ESAL, the Papa Saw podcast twice now with Tim, and that was. I mean, they're really nice guys. I enjoy talking to them, but they just don't even start talking about like Black Lives Matter or anything like that, because they just, as soon as you bring up anything like institutional racism or anything like that, nope, doesn't exist, doesn't happen, nope, just shut down completely, just gone. And then I've been on the Dolphin Radio dude thing, and we didn't even talk about stuff. That was the point. We talked about stuff that kind of I was interested in, like music and books and things like that. So that was kind of fun, So it wasn't really about issues or whatever, but
So it sounds like chrisiousity had a starting out fine experience and then it degenerated. And by the way, Edzia, I'm going to talk to you about like listening in focus groups and how we do it and why it's important, just because I want to bring you into the conversation because you're still here. Sorry. But yeah, and then you had a wingman both 2 times. So yeah, I guess in some ways you guys aren't really making me move to change my mind that much. But I think the Dolphin Show is something that because you guys had vouched for it, I'm going to try to find some time later this month. But obviously the front of this month is a little jam packed. So
I'm actually going on a show with him this afternoon, and we're going to be talking about like New Zealand and shit. I think it's really, really cool. He's a really nice guy, and if you do the thing which it's called Outside the Wheelhouse or whatever, where you talk about things that you really interest you and make you passionate besides politics and all this sort of shit. It's really cool. He's a really nice guy, and you can have a really, really good talk about that. So it's cool.
Yeah. So getting back to the point of hearing what other people are saying, I wanted to bring Edzia in because she's run a lot of focus groups. And so she's had to do active listening in the moment and to hear what the point of the person is saying and then try to expand on that point. So because you hadn't talked for a long time, I wanted to make sure you got to in, especially if you're going to be heading out soon. So when you're running a focus group, what is your aim when people are talking, and how do you what's your praxis?
I think it will be the same thing when I run the seminar. I mean, it's to make people feel comfortable and to make them feel that I'm listening to them and that they don't feel that they are being used, that I want to get something out of them. And so they feel valued, and so that they will speak their mind and they don't go away from it feeling like they've been used in any way, and that, you know, I wasn't interested in what they were saying. So even no matter what they're saying, I mean, and that's the reason why I didn't challenge that student, because I didn't want to create a situation for him where he felt like he couldn't share his opinions with the rest of the class because he was saying things that were controversial or that were not accepted or that would make him a pariah in a way. So I think with the focus groups, I mean, you and I have had the same situation where I've certainly been concerned about what people say and what they hold back because of the color of my skin, particularly when we were talking about issues related to Brexit or issues related to immigration. I've certainly been very concerned about whether we are making people comfortable enough, whether they feel comfortable enough to tell us what they think, because that's the point of speak their mind, whatever that is. And so for me, with the active listening, I think I'm paying more attention to their body language and to the nonverbal communication more than the specifics of what they're saying.
Okay, yeah, that's great, because I think, you know, there are kind of different conversations that are had when there are people in the room who are generally on the same page and can have reasonable disagreements between them, and the dynamic when there are clearly two opposing sides, people who have, you know, stated positions and there's an antagonism there. So, you know, I would hope that, you know, if the anti-feminist movement on YouTube, and again, getting back to the YouTube world in the end of this show, the way that it works right now is there's a lot of ponage, but that's, I think, Trump is changing that, because the attacks that Trump is making on things that people value, like marriage equality and trans rights and basic free speech issues, it's going to mean that the focus of critique is necessarily, I think, going to have to engage with that. We've seen it with Milo, and we've seen it with other things that have happened since Trump has actually taken office. And, you know, maybe a way to, some people might want to create a niche in that market by having real conversations with feminists, rather than, you know, like when Barron kicked Michael off the Hangout because he wouldn't concede Michael's point. So, yeah, I don't know who.
Safe space.
Yes. And I think that would be good, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about feminism and women's issues and intersectionality out there. And we see it in our comments all the time, you know, people who come up and make blanket statements that are just empirically false. And when you present them with evidence, they won't engage with it. But if they have role models who are engaging with it, then maybe there can be some change.
I think like I was kind of saying before, this kind of feeling of not being able to accept when you're wrong, you know, like always feeling like you're right about your opinion or your beliefs or whatever, and then just, I mean, I suppose it's kind of human nature in a sense, but not being open to having your ideas challenged. I feel it comes from that, being so confident that you're right about this thing, all the things, and then just so just not being okay with being wrong. I mean, I saw it with the Bear Man, of just, he never, his whole thing was just wanting to be right, and I am right, and this is the way that it is, and I'm right, and that's it. You know, there's just no openness at all. You know. Yeah.
I was actually going to ask. Oh, I was actually going to ask it because Adzia took her mic off, and I wanted to ask her what happens in a classroom when two students disagree, how she handles it. And then could you jump in, chrisiousity?
Yeah, I actually had a question for Adzia as well.
Okay,
so.
Well then, you know what? Why don't you ask your question, and then after you ask your question, she answers. Laura is up.
Oh, sorry. Just while we still have you here, one of the things I have been doing is sort of investing a lot of time into looking into Richard Spencer and the ideology of the far right and sort of these neo-Nazi groups, and their attitude towards human rights is really that they don't have an attitude towards humans. It's just nonsense to them. You might as well talk to them about unicorns. Quite really, they don't care. So I wondered if you were concerned with some of these things that have been going on, or some of the ideas, and what you think that, do you think it's just that people don't understand what kind of ideas these people represent, or do you think that, why do you think that they are attractive? Do you have any sense of that?
Could I add to the question real quick before she answers?
It's a pretty difficult question, but go for it.
I also like just the smallest thing. Like, are these people that influential outside of the internet? I feel like me personally am in a sort of internet bubble where, you know, the people that I see as influential may not necessarily be outside. I mean, we saw that Milo kind of became a little bit influential, but I'm not sure about Mr. Spencer. So I just kind of wanted to add that to the thing as well.
Wow. Okay. So I'll just kind of rephrase the question because I think it'll help me answer it, and I hope that's okay. Sorry, this is like a teacher hat on. So for me, actually, there's two issues, right? So there's the first issue, which you've said. There are a group of people who believe something, who are very vocal about it, who have no problems stating it, and then there are people who are quite either vocal or quiet about supporting that that group of or that ideology or that way of thinking. And for me, there's another issue, which is people who know what this first group stands for, but who will support the outcome on the same side in terms of the outcome, even though they don't profess the ideology. So for me, the example would be Brexit, right? Or you can also say conservative Republicans and the the alt-right. The end goal may be the same, and they don't mind the fact that they are on the same side. So the fact that you are on the same side as a neo-Nazi doesn't give you pause, even though you're not a neo-Nazi yourself. Those two issues, and I think they're slightly different. I'm definitely concerned about what's happening with the rise of neo-Nazism, fascism, and however you want to term it, in its new guise. And I cannot understand why it's happening. I mean, part of me trying to go down the route of trying to understand people's opinions on human rights is actually precisely to answer that question. I want to think when it comes to human rights, and I want to try and understand that a little bit more. My intuition is that people have been fed a certain idea about what human rights are by the media, and I'll use the media very broadly. So there's a very accepted understanding of what human rights are, and nobody seems to want to critique that understanding or take on alternative ways of looking at human rights or understanding human rights. So in the UK, for example, human rights are often portrayed as the rights that criminals have and use against victims or against innocents. Or you'll have the notion of human rights being portrayed as the rights that terrorists use to protect themselves from the law. And obviously that's not what human rights are, but that's the way it's portrayed in the media over and over and over again in certain sections of the media, and you don't hear the opposite. There's nobody giving the opposite side. The government's not standing up and saying that's not what human rights are. Human rights groups, if they say that, are seen as being biased, or because you're a human rights group, so why should I believe you? So there isn't really a neutral party that I can see that's making the opposite case. And so I think for people on both sides of that divide, or the two groups that I mentioned earlier, the neo-Nazi groups, people who sincerely believe in that ideology, and people who fall on that side of the spectrum but don't believe that ideology, I think they're both consuming this version of what certain things are, and they don't seem to think that there is another way of thinking about it. And so for me, the challenge really is moving forward this, and then how can you change it? So it's a very difficult question. I don't know if I've answered your question, but my sense is that the media has a very big role to play in this, because I think people consume it without even realizing it.
Yep.
And you're talking also, and sorry, Laura, just in the UK context in particular, there is this framing of basically, issues to do with rights in law for criminality, terrorism, with linking that with human rights. That's a very popular sort of way that the Daily Mail and other kind of right-leaning media portray human rights. That's what you're referring to, right?
That's what I'm referring to. So, the basic notion of human rights is that everybody has them. It doesn't matter who you are and what you've done. The fact that you're a human being means that you have the right to live a basic life of dignity. Yes, you may be in prison, but that doesn't mean you have to be treated like an animal, right? So, I mean, the core idea of human rights is to be able to live a life of dignity, irrespective of who you are, and irrespective of what you've done. And I think sometimes the focus in the media or in some sections of the media is on certain aspects of how that core idea is implemented. And, that becomes the narrative, then that becomes the discourse. And if you don't stop and think about what human rights are, and if you haven't studied it or you haven't actually read about it, then that's what you're consuming. And that's the only thing you're consuming. So I feel that, that has a lot to do with how people think about human rights,
Right.
in particular, at least.
Okay, Laura, sorry I cut you off, but I just wanted to expand on that. So go ahead.
Oh, no. I mean, I was just, agreeing in that, I mean, even right now, right, the media right now is reporting, so not to pivot, but reporting now on the new House bill, right? That this bill, they're going into long explanations about what this bill, could do.
This is a healthcare bill?
Yeah, the healthcare bill, yes. And so it's to replace the Affordable Care Act. And so right now, and I've seen several articles because I am, in the pharmaceutical industry. So I actually have read several articles already. So certain hospitals, certain doctors advocacy, like groups, are actually coming out and saying like, this isn't a good bill. Like, and they are saying, this is how we would impact these different communities, right? And so instead of, I feel like this is one thing that the media isn't doing correctly, is that instead of stating yes, the Republicans have come out with a new bill, why don't they say, and then as a footnote, the Hospital Association of America has said that this is going to be a lot of problems for Medicaid, it's going to be XYZ, and talk about the groups that are like against it and not just pitting Republicans against Democrats, because then it's not moving the conversation forward and possibly trying to change minds or even elicit, I would say, curiosity in the news watcher to then say, oh, you know what, let me go look that up. Let me go see what the hospital, group is saying about this. And let me go into Medicaid and see what that, what that requires or what that's about. Because I think that all they're doing is regurgitating, right, what we already know, that Republicans have very different ideas than Democrats, but then they're not saying what these other outside groups who are going to be instrumentally affected, right, they're not voicing, their concerns and their voice. Because so then it's just, I feel like it's just the same narrative over and over again.
Yeah, I think there's a big discussion to be had about the language that the media uses and framing, and also this notion. It doesn't really exist so much in the UK, and I don't know about in New Zealand. But in the UK, it's pretty. There's a left-right spectrum politically, and you know where the papers fall if you read them across them. You start to see the patterns very quickly. In the US, they like to pretend they're objective, but it seems to me that everyone's got a perspective. It's more like perspective journalism. Everything that goes into a newspaper or into an evening news report has been selected by somebody. So things have been filtered out, and so other things have been given priority, and angles have been decided, or they've done some kind of false equivalency where they treat both sides the same, and maybe they don't really show the nuance or this, like on climate change issues, they give equal time to the denialist and to the person who actually knows what they're talking about. So yeah, there's how we unconsciously learn how to think about stories based on how the media frame them is independent from how they actually exist. And I notice a lot of times when you talk to people who are academics, they're a lot of times point to the things they don't know about. And you're like, well, why do you keep talking about the things you don't know about? And that's because we try to be cautious and to, you know, say limited things and restrict ourselves. But people in the media don't really do that. And then other people who hear that certainly don't do that. So.
Right. And even, you know, in the group, you know, that I'm in the pharmaceutical land, if you will, you know, the pharmaceutical industry, it's, you know, they were right, you know, when the Affordable Care Act was coming out, you know, like all kinds of people were, because it affected, you know, us, like kind of like the boots on the ground and kind of, you know, the narrative and what doctors were saying. Some doctors were very against it. Some doctors were, and you just kind of wanted to play neutral, you know, as a representative, back when, you know, the Affordable Care Act was passed. And it was interesting because I got on several, you know, calls with my company and just said, you know, here's the thing. I don't think that you need to get into an ideological discussion, you know, with physicians. I said, but, you know, honestly, I mean, if more people are getting covered, which is the point of this, then that means that we actually, as representatives, have more opportunity. And then, therefore, then and as a I guess extension of that, more people are going to have access to doctors. They're going to have more access to, you know, dermatology, which was in the field that I was in, and they're going to actually get that mole checked out, or they're actually going to get, you know, XYZ available to them. I said, so actually, the Affordable Care Act is good for us. And it was so interesting because I don't think nobody ever explained that to them. And I was like surprised that like nobody had thought of that. That it's like, this is actually opportunity because more people are getting care. That means there's an opportunity for them to prescribe X, Y, and Z. So it's not about even, you know, getting into that discussion with the doctor and saying, well, how it's going to affect you. But it's like your rooms are going to be packed. Your schedule is going to be packed. And time is money when it comes to visiting doctors in America. And so I was like, we need to be able to flip that switch. But it was interesting how people even who didn't know that the Affordable Care Act was actually an advantage to them saw it as something bad based on the media that they you know, were watching every day or reading about, and they're basically, you know, biases already that, you know, somehow this was bad for them.
Right.
Do you think that from the media's point of view of trying to portray things in like a equal, fair way, that can lead to these kind of issues? Like, I was reading a like a blog post thing about the idea of equality and equality as an end goal, and when that's the focus, it can lead to not equality. You know, so when things are unequal, if you're focusing on just equality, then all it tends to do is maintain the status quo, right? So,
or no, right.
Yeah, so if the media, like Kristi's example of the climate change thing, if you're giving equal airtime to the denialist and the scientists, then it's coming off completely wrong, because you're not portraying it the way it's not technically fair, because, you know, I mean, you're doing it in the interests of being equal and fair or whatever, but it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I would say yes. I mean, that there is like a false equivalency. And I actually, it was funny that you actually bring up, you know, climate change, because I actually just saw an interview with Bill Nye and Tucker Carlson from Fox News. And so, I mean, right. You're just like, oh my gosh. And so, but it was interesting because, you know, when Kristi said, you know, as academics, like we tend to be more cautious. And literally, like, that was what came to mind when I was thinking about, you know, Bill Nye and how his points were more cautious. So he was saying, like, look, it's not that, you know, there's a disagreement in the science community, but that we know that it, you know, it affects, it's affecting, like it's happening now. But he was cautious in the way he was saying it. He wasn't as assertive, I would say, as Tucker Carlson, because Tucker Carlson was just like, well, to what degree has human activity caused climate change? And here I'm thinking as like a salesperson, right? The salesperson hat, or like a debater. It's like, it's not about the degree, because we already know that it's already happening, and that it's the you know, ice that is, it's so much less, right, than it was to begin with. So it's not even about that. Like, that's not even the right question. The question is like, you know, or an analogy is it's a rock rolling downhill. Do you want to catch, the rock when it's like, and pull it back up, right? When it's almost halfway down the hill, or when it's all the way down the hill? Or do you want to start, right, and grab that rolling rock before it even starts midway down the hill?
Yeah.
Which point, right, are you going to stop that rock from rolling down? And
it seems like
Mhm.
Oh no, go ahead.
No,
I was
no,
just
no,
going to say
done.
that like someone mentioned before about one of the reasons why they thought Trump won is because people were offering definitive answers, right? So you've got these people making these definitive statements about the climate change or whatever, and then and for some reason that's more appealing than the tentative way that science works. There's no definitive statements. It's all tentative. There's no declarations of absolute truth, but that
Right.
is something that resonates with people, and it makes it very difficult for the scientists to communicate that. I suppose that that this is happening. Yeah, it's a thing that's happening, but it can be very frustrating. Yeah.
So to bring it back, there's one topic I would like to talk about, especially I would like to get chrisiousiti's perspective, living in the States, and Michael's too, and getting also more to the theme of International Women's Day. Is an interesting conversation, but I thought then I could bring it back to this and wrap it up. And Edzia too, she's got experience probably with her colleagues and other people she knows in the UK, and it goes to the issue of the wage gap. And I want to have a little bit of a discussion about it, but not that kind of conversation. I want to have a slightly next level conversation about the wage gap.
Oh,
Yeah. Right, because when people, especially on YouTube, talk about the wage gap, there's a discussion as to sort of whether it exists and if it, or basically it exists, but it exists for these reasons. And the conversations I don't see us having are making the step beyond that, which is, well, okay, let's just all agree that there is, that there are a lot of ways to measure wages. And no matter how you measure it, whether it's averages or by cross-tabulation or using, sex and maybe ethnicity, or if you use a regression model that controls for other things, even in the models that are able to account for 95% of the variance between men and women's wages in similar industries, similar ages, similar experiences, there is this unexplained gap that remains. Now, so if you want to say it's down to structural problems because women have babies, or if you want to come bring it down to the issue of it's a policy issue because we don't have appropriate policies, I think the question really is that do we want to live in a society that is structured in such a way that women are almost necessarily disadvantaged for perpetuating the species, for doing the species the favor of allowing it to continue by giving their bodies and their time and their life in order to make more people? And if we think that that shouldn't be something that our society financially punishes, how do we structure our society in such a way that that doesn't happen and that is good for families? So I don't, Adzia, you look like you're kind of heading toward the door. So do you want to answer first? I can see by your body language, because, I'm doing active listening, like you said.
Yeah, I know. I was kind of trying to signal to you through my body language that,
and then you
Sam's got dinner ready, so ready to go eat. I don't know how to tell you the truth, because I actually don't think that there is agreement on whether there is a wage gap. It's the usual thing. I mean, people still question it, and then people question the reasons for it. So I think the premise of your question is about accepting that there are structural reasons for a wage gap. And I think if we accept that, then the answer would be very different to saying that a wage gap is because of certain industries, or because of the expectation of certain gendered roles, or because of how men see women, or whatever. So I think for me, and perhaps this is me being an academic, which is not always a good thing, is kind of trying to figure out why there is a wage gap. And then for me, the answer would then proceed from the response to that initial question.
I think one,
Your question.
yeah,
Sorry.
I think one is you're taking an empirical approach and I'm taking a normative one.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Okay.
Thank you for your time. Say hi to Sam.
It was great
and
talking to you.
The kiddies
I'm
are
so
talking.
Yeah,
glad to meet you.
Oh, love bombs everywhere.
Yeah. Well, super
Yes.
cool. Super cool.
Thank you.
So, bye.
Bye.
Yeah, click the X, don't hang. Okay, good. Whew, she didn't shut down the hangout. Chrisiousity. This might be something that you have a deep amount of experience and wisdom to speak to from about the impact of this. Oh, is she away from her computer?
Nope, she don't care.
Oh.
Hang on one second.
Okay, no worries. We'll kick it over. Laura, do you want to
Hi.
give your thoughts? Hey, yeah.
Sure. Well, lately I
Oh, I'm
so-
back. I made him pause the TV, so I don't know how long that will last.
Oh,
so
okay,
can I
okay.
jump?
Oh, go ahead.
I'm
Go ahead.
So basically, one of the things that I think that I have brought up to certain people who are interested in men's issues and men's rights, and they're very interested in custody battles, you know, or a perceived difference in who gets custody and whether or not there's bias there. You know, Devin, stop it.
Stop.
Devin, just stop it. Sorry.
No worries.
Siblings, they love to just argue over nothing. Anyway, so is the question of custody is almost a mirror image of the question of the wage gap, right? So it's of course against the law to go and just give someone preferential treatment in a court because of their plumbing, just as it is against the law to give somebody more money because of their plumbing, right? But we have these sort of gendered roles and gendered expectations, and we also have a situation where people live up to those expectations, right? Women are raised to believe it's kind of their responsibility to make sure the kids are taken care of and make sure the older people in their families are taken care of and the sick people in their families are taken care of. And so they do that, right? And even they do make that choice, but it's not a choice that's made out of nowhere, right? It's a choice that you know that we're sort of guided to from our very first. Hang on.
Oh, I had my mic on too. So yeah, Laura, do you want to build on that at all? By the way, I just want to point out that Chrisiossity's analogy between the pay gap and the custody bias arguments being analogous is just so smart. She's so smart. Okay.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking the same thing when she brought that up, for sure. And so one that actually so even though my industry is pretty lucrative, I have definitely faced the wage gap disparity, and even it wasn't even two amongst a white male versus myself, but it was another female and then myself. And so to kind of have that reality, it was pretty it was saddening, like I was sad about it, but then I got pissed, right? Which was my, kind of like natural, I guess, like reaction, to kind of when there's an inequality. But I think that even now, because I'm looking for work right now, looking for opportunities, and I think it starts off with even the recruiter even asking, what is your kind of like salary, requirements? And because I think that, for instance, if you're starting off at say, 40,000 and then, you say 40,000, but really someone who was in that position before got 60,000, you're already selling yourself short. And it's like, and trust me, I've read all kinds of articles that have talked about, how to not talk about your salary or how to, pivot to them and have them say, a number first. they're pretty skilled in what they do. And so despite, kind of my efforts, sometimes you kind of have to come out with a number and you do have to do some research. But I think it starts with, in the United States now, there are some states that now it's prohibited to ask about salary, previous salary history. And I think it's,
What?
I think it's in like Massachusetts, I feel like. And yeah, and I don't know where else, but I think that that's a start in not having to kind of go over your salary history, because if you think about it, if someone starts off right, at $10,000, but then that in reality it's $20,000, like that person is never going to catch up unless they either go to school, right, to get a more advanced degree, or somehow jump up a couple of levels, or rise quickly in management. And so I think that's a start in order to, try to eliminate the pay gap. But then I think that especially in competitive areas like here, like the Washington, D.C. metro area, over 38% of the population here has a bachelor's degree, which is a good thing, but it also drives the cost up a lot of real estate, rent, of just living expenses. The cost of living is so much higher here because we have so many more educated people, and so then oftentimes you're in a real struggle and uphill battle, right, to try to compete with that. And so I'm kind of at a point where it's like I'm definitely in the next at least couple of years going to get my master's degree. And when I wouldn't necessarily say need it in the Midwest, that I would be, based on my experience, based on the college degree that I already have right now, I would be fine. I know in this area, I need to have a master's degree to be more competitive and to seek the salary that I desire for this area.
Yeah, and that kind of
There's
builds
also
on. Oh, go ahead, Michael, and then I'll go ahead.
I was just going to say there's that taboo against sharing what your salary is with your coworkers and stuff as well, right? There just seems to be kind of like a social taboo where you don't talk about how much you earn, or you don't, and so that makes it easier or makes it more difficult for the workers to see what should be an appropriate earning for them, because they have no idea they've got nothing to compare it to,
Yeah, and that actually goes to my point, which was going to bring it back to my question about structures. So if we have a situation where you do have cultures where, of course, it's in management's interest for people to not know what each other are making, they create a culture, where that's unacceptable. And actually in some places it's, against company policy to share what your salary is. And so this then builds in, between employees,
Surely
you
that's
don't
against,
have
like,
a
workers'
sense of,
rights or something, right?
depends on the
Like,
law. Depends, there's no, I mean, there might be concept of fundamental human rights, but it's actually what's on the books that matters. And so, yeah, I think, I've worked quite a lot of not all of my full-time employment has been with state governments, but I have worked for state governments, and my salary was always public because there's a formula that they use with different levels. And as a consequence, I was asked like what I wanted to make, because it was already predetermined based on my experience, my education, and what the position level was. I don't understand why we can't have more of that. And that was one of Obama's things was about pay transparency and pay equality. And that's an easy, simple thing that wouldn't just benefit women, although it would benefit women disproportionately. It would benefit everybody. Like you said, someone comes in with a salary and it's a negotiation. They don't know that going in, or they're not good at negotiating. They could pay for that financially for the rest of their lives. And is that really the kind of society we want to have? And when we have a more equitable society, then you're going to have less pay disparity between men and women, because everyone's going to be within the same range. And if there are some jobs where, negotiation is part of the job, maybe in some Wall Street things or real estate, or they want to operate on knowing the negotiation skills of their own employees, well, then maybe declare that up front, that we're a negotiating salary business.
Mhm.
you know, in that way. You know, I'm perfectly fine with people having the ability to negotiate, but I think it should be declared, you know, as one of the things that you know about the job. Another thing would be, and this isn't an issue really outside of the United States and maybe one other country in the world, but paid parental leave. And I've lived in 3 countries now over the course of my life, 2 of which had paid parental leave. And I have to say, working in Germany, and of course I work for a larger institution, so in total we've got over maybe, you know, 250 employees, but they have I mean, the way that they've integrated paid parental leave into the corporate life, if you want to say in that way. I've had several of my colleagues disappear for a year because they went on paid parental leave. And then, you know what, they come back and they go back to their jobs, and then they bring their kids around from time to time because now they have a baby. And we have a place, an office space with a computer and various things for kids. It's called an like an Eltern-Kind-Raum or something, Zimmer. It's a parents and children room. And that's where if you can't, your daycare falls through or something happens, or you need to come to the office and you can't leave your kid with anyone, you work in that room. And it's hooked up to the network, and you can be with your kid and be in that room, and then just, you know, your problem is solved.
That is crazy. Do you know how crazy that sounds?
And it's the easiest thing in the world. It's just an extra office that nobody sat in. And
No,
then they put
I
kids' toys and
know.
books in it.
But like living in the United States, like that's
Yeah.
craziness.
Yeah, so my colleague
You
now...
damn socialist scum.
And because of the flexibility, my colleague has gone, well, she goes, you start maternity leave, because women take maternity leave 4 weeks before their due date.
Mhm.
That way they can be home and rest and get their house ready and prepare for the baby. And when it comes, it comes. And then once the baby is born, the parents' time starts between 2 parents. And she is going to be off like 100% of a time for like the first few months, but then she wants to come back 20% of the time because she's managing a project. And
Right.
we've hired someone at 80% time, or 100% then 80%, who's going to take over for her for like about a year, and then she's going to come back. And then her husband will take time because she's only taken 80%, she can stretch it out longer, yada, yada, yada. But then the fathers get time as well. So he's going to be able to take time off of work and stay at home. And one of my other colleagues who had a baby, he did his sort of right at the end as well. So that seems to be, you know, the mother is sort of physically more needed early on when the baby arrives, and then, you know, after 8 months, 9 months, 12 months, it's easier for the dad to do that solo when the mom goes to work. And I just wish Americans could experience how easy you can have it all, or at least a lot more than people do now.
Right. And if you even bring up about the physical, right? Because it's the women who take off, you know, who take their time first. And I was reading, you know, an article that, you know, basically said it takes like a woman's body about a year actually to kind of recover from childbirth and to kind of get things, you know, to like where they were before childbirth. And like that's an astounding you know, amount of time in a year. And then, you know, here it's, if you're lucky enough to have a paid maternity leave, you know, job, I mean, it's within 6 weeks oftentimes that you know, have to go back to work if you're lucky, you know, to have, you know, anywhere 4 to 6 weeks. And then we're talking about for a woman's body to recover completely is about a year.
And
like,
it's entirely unpaid.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, and now more and more, you know, there are households.
6 weeks is unpaid.
12 weeks. It's actually a total of, if you work for a company that has more than 50 employees, you're entitled to up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave.
Right.
You also, I believe, have to have worked there for 1 year and be full time, if I remember right.
That's probably right.
There's a lot of rules. So if you're in one of those places where they make sure to only give you 32 hours a week because they don't want to pay your health insurance, you know, because health insurance also often goes through work, and probably will again now that, you know, the affordable health care is getting...
Oh,
could I ask a question real quick?
Of course.
It's kind of related. So, you know, when you bring up the wage gap and you start talking about it or whatever, and then a common response you'll hear is, that's not a wage gap, that's an earnings gap. Can someone explain that to me?
No.
That doesn't make any sense to me.
I can explain it because I've finally figured out from them what it means. They're trying to change it because wage and earnings mean the same thing, right? So it's like saying it's not an apple, it's an apple. You know, it's okay. But what they're trying to do is, instead of there's a gap because women aren't being paid as much, there's a gap because women aren't earning as much. So the impetus is on the woman to earn more instead of collecting a wage
So it's
fairly.
the whole they're
That's-
not earning as much because of their choices thing.
Yeah, which, you know, like I said, there's a handful of things that any society has to do, whether you are a small tribe in the jungle or, you know, the biggest metropolis in the world. And one of them is to bear and raise your next generation, right? That's kind of key.
Yeah.
Your society does not survive if your society doesn't do that. And so every society in the world has to have some sort of system for doing that. But one of the sort of things I see is this.
Oh my god, I love it. I love background.
Yeah. He's on my lap going, yeah.
He's talking
Because
back.
because I think he's seeing the bubble, because when you see
Yeah.
the bubble, it's like that's what he's doing.
So, and usually I would not make people suffer through this, but you know, it is Women's Day, and I think we should all respect
Man, I'm enjoying it. I'm
what
thinking it's real
women.
cute.
We need to respect what women go through, you know.
Thank you. Yes.
So,
That's just me normally. It is 10:30 in the morning after all. I'm just sort of like, oh.
So, chrisiousity, did you have another point?
Sorry,
before I
yes,
jump
what
in?
was I?
We were
what
talking
did I
about
just say?
earnings and wages and.
Oh, yeah. I guess it's one of the bad parts of having this sort of ultra individualist society that acts as if, you know, acts as if there's only total individualism or total collectivism. You know, you're either in some kind of wild, wild west, or you're in a communist state. You know, I mean, that seems to be the way it gets framed a lot, which I think is just absurd. But no, we're a society. We have children. We need to raise these children. We need to bear these children. We need to bring them up in a way so that they can take the society on to the next generation. Because guess what? We're going to die. So, you know,
Happy
I
International Women's Day, everyone. You're all going to die.
We are.
Thanks and good night.
Well, yeah.
On the issue of the
Yeah, I do.
earnings and the wages. So yeah, if they're saying that basically, for the statistic, for instance, that men do more overtime than women, what they decontextualize that though. I mean, let's imagine the situation where a man and a woman together have a child, and they're living in the United States, and the woman has no paid sick leave. He doesn't have any paid sick leave. You know, they get 2 weeks of paid vacation. That's it. And between them, their child becomes ill. So if they're in a traditional jobs, he's making slightly more than her because of the wage gap. So financially, it makes more sense for her to take time off of work to stay home with a sick child. And then when the family needs more money, because without paid sick leave, their income has gone down, she stays at home while he does the overtime. This is an explanation of when men, you know, might work more overtime than women. It's because the women are, you know, staying at home with the kids when they're ill disproportionately, and then they're also with the kids when the men are working the overtime to make up for that lost income. I mean, you have to look at the context. It's a yin yang when it comes to family life, in my view.
Right.
And the work has
so
to be
interesting.
done. You know, it's not like if you have an adult parent with Alzheimer's, you can just leave them somewhere, drop them off, you know, on the side of the road and just go to work. It's not like if you have children who are sick, you can just go, oh, well, you know, you're 5, make it work. You know, it's not like that. This is work that has to be done. The work of keeping a shelter together, a home, and keeping it in the state where it won't be condemned by a health department has to get done. You know, clothes have to be washed. You know, we all have to, these are things that aren't optional. And it just, a lot of that just gets shafted onto women, and they, you know, they've been raised to do it. They've been raised to think, oh yeah, it is my job to do that and make sure that that gets done.
Can I tell a story?
Go for it.
Oh, this
Ooh,
when
story
I
time.
was I was teaching. Well, I wasn't teaching. Sorry, I was running the seminars on modern British politics when I was a graduate teaching assistant, and we were talking about the social, like these kinds of issues about women taking on these roles disproportionately. And one of the women worked for a member of parliament. They were at a constituency sort of gathering in their local constituency, talking about issues with the NHS. And there was an elderly gentleman who got up and said, you know, we're spending too much money on all these things, and you know, we need to cut back on the services. We need to go back to how it used to be when we had people at home who took care of people when they got older. They're called daughters. And just this idea of women's unpaid labor, that, you know, there's an expectation that that's, when you have girls, then you know that someone's going to take care of you when you get older. The son will, you know, kind of be there. Probably in the older days he was providing financially, but the person who nurses you and takes you through all that, that's going to be your daughter, if you have daughters. And yeah, so that expectation is very powerful, not just in, like, you know, the media, but in family relationships as well.
In every relationship. I mean, I can't think of anywhere I've been that women weren't really hard on each other and themselves, you know, for not being the greatest mother ever. You know what I mean? We're really, really, speaking of stories here, I can tell you a story. So I worked in a company, and they had like this motivational thing that they were doing where they had a thank you board, right? So the boss puts us up and says, if you see somebody doing something nice or a little bit above and beyond, just, you can post a little thank you, like somebody helped you out, somebody pitched in when they didn't have to. You know, it was cute. So after a couple of weeks, actually probably more like a month, the boss, who was a woman, said, all right, I just want to talk to my female employees, so we're just going to have a female employees meeting. So we all came in and didn't know what was up, and she said, listen, the thank you board, only women use it, and they only use it to thank men. And we're just sort of looking at each other like,
wow,
that's true. And I never thought of, you know, it's not like we were thinking about it. And so, you know, as she's like, I'm trying to figure out why this is, you know, and one of the women sort of said, well, we're women, we don't need to be thanked. The men are the ones that want that, you know, so it's sort of this. And I'm sitting there, and this is before I really knew a lot about feminism, and I was like, Devin, honey, could you pause that for a second? Like, mind blown. Like, do I think this way? Is this something, because this is, I did it. I didn't thank the other women. You know, I didn't expect to be thanked. But if a guy did something, I was like, oh, I better put that up on the thank you board, because like, where is this gendered expectation that I didn't know I had in my head? You know, so
Hashtag masculinity too fragile.
it was, it is, and it's an assumption, you know. So I've kind of said to, like I've said to my husband, like, when women go overboard thanking you for simple things, be a little insulted.
The bar is low.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, it is deeply cultural. I mean, it starts from birth, from, you know, the way that if you tell people that they're handling, if you give people a baby to hold, and you tell them it's a boy or a girl, they'll play more aggressively with the boy and bounce him up and down, and they'll sort of cuddle and coo at the girl. So, I mean, it starts really, really young, and it does take self-reflection to unpack what you assume is natural. And just very briefly, I remember I met an academic who, she lived in Europe and her husband and her children lived in California. And I remember my reaction was, that's so weird to me that a woman would leave her children behind. And then I thought, but I wouldn't have had the same reaction if she'd been a man. And
Yep.
so that turned me back on myself, going, okay, where is this coming from? So I kind of recognize that, what Chrisiousity was saying. Anyone want to?
Yeah, self-reflection is important and hard for some people. So that kind of stuff, I suppose, can be perpetuated quite easily because people are either unable to or unwilling to look at, the things the way that they are and reflect on that and potentially see how that's not necessarily harmful, I suppose, but just kind of, reinforcing these kind of things, and you find that and then that kind of leads to people, mocking that kind of stuff, oh, there's no such thing as internalized misogyny or whatever, the idea that the way that you're brought up in a society doesn't affect how you interact with the rest of society. I mean, to me, that just sounds ludicrous. You can't. What? How could you seriously think that there's no, you've got no impact from the way that from your upbringing, or also from the society that you're brought up in? The idea that I mean, I suppose they wouldn't be saying that that there's no impact, but I suppose there's just things that they choose. And no, that's not something that happens. And no, that's not, the idea that these things can't be like an internalized and like you guys sort of mentioned, how it's kind of an unconscious thing. You don't even think about it. How those things can't be a part of us and can't affect the way that we interact with other people, and then can't en masse affect other people en masse, when there is a larger population or group of people that behave or believe things in a certain way, how that can't affect other people. I find that astounding that is a contentious idea.
Yeah, how about you, Laura?
No, and I mean, I would agree with that. I think that, for instance, in my own family, my mom, Catholic, she, had to take a lot of responsibility on as a child, when she was growing up, in Mexico, and she had to start cooking at the age of 8 years old, for my grandfather. Because my grandmother had actually given birth, and she was unable to stand for long periods of times, and she was on bed rest. And so it was interesting because so when my sister got married to a Caucasian male, it was interesting because my mom sometimes would not speak directly to my brother-in-law. And she would sort of speak to my sister and my mom, I mean, she's fluent in both English and Spanish, but there was something that I think about her cultural upbringing that you don't ask directly, I guess, like to the quote unquote man of the house. And this was not something that, you know what I'm saying, like it was, for her to do on purpose or that she was consciously thinking. I think that just out of respect, that's what my mom did, because I think at such a young age, she was forced to do that. She was forced to kind of, be in this, sort of, I wouldn't say servant role, but, take on a very critical role of cooking and doing a lot of things for the family without necessarily being the head of the family, if you will. And so, it was very interesting to me how my mom, it was very hard to break my mom of that habit. Because then I would notice it too. And I would just be like, you know what, mom, like you are the same, if not, have actually, you should have more respect, I said, than him. I said, and so, I don't understand, like, why you don't talk to him kind of directly. And so, we did definitely had to break my mom kind of that habit. And so I think it didn't come from a place of having saying that there were rules in place, but she just kind of did it automatically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm going to take this conversation totally off of like International Women's Day, but this is an interesting topic to me, so I'm exercising my chair authority here. What you talked about when you were telling that story reminds me a bit about something that Louis C.K. talks about in one of his shows. The core of it is, and also what we have these with chrisiousiti's story and my story and your mom's story, this idea that when you're a child, there are norms about the world that are formed, and they are truths about how things are done or how things should be. But then as we live our lives, we get the opportunity for contact with other people who don't have that worldview, and we get a glimpse into a different way of organizing a family or a society or something else. And when my experience getting older is that I have more and more of these moments where I'm dislocated from an earlier point self in time, like the child self and then the teen self, and then you get into your 20s and you keep refining. And the Louis C.K. story he told about, he told about the time that he was talking to a friend about his experiences early in the club scene, and one of the club owners was gay. And he was saying, yeah, that guy, he always, was hitting on me and harassing me. And his friend's like, really? So did he say things to you that make you feel really uncomfortable? He's like, no, he was just, he was just kind of harassing me. He's like, did he make sexual advances on you? He's like, well, no, nothing like that. But, I just always felt like he was trying to get me into bed. And he said, as he talked himself through the story, what he realized was, the guy was never trying to hit on him. He was just 19 and uncomfortable because he'd never met a gay man before.
Oh,
but in his
interesting.
But in his history, in his head, was that guy was always trying to hit on me. But it never happened. And these moments of being open to that, reflection, and then you have a bit of a world shift, and then maybe that leads on to other things as well. But yeah, so diversion. But I thought an interesting one.
I feel like I need to tell a story now because everyone else is telling stories.
Yes, tell a story.
Story time. What a story.
Time. Gather around, children. Let me weave you a tale. No, I actually kind of wanted to just say something really quickly about something that was said way earlier by Idzia. Is that her name? She was talking about
Edzia.
Sorry,
Edzia. I've actually
yeah.
heard it pronounced lots of different ways. It kind of depends on what your accent is, I think.
Yeah, I probably pronounce everything wrong. But she was talking about the rise of neo-Nazism and stuff. Sorry, this is like completely away from what we were just talking about. I wanted to bring it up before, but I kind of never found the time, and I just got to barge my way in now. But she mentioned about how there's these the neo-Nazis basically who have this idea and have these ideas about people and human rights and all that sort of stuff, and they have an end goal in mind, and then there's another group of people who I suppose have the same end goal but don't agree with a bunch of the other kind of Nazi stuff, the kind of awful things, but they kind of have this symbiotic relationship which helps to push the movement forward, I suppose. And I found that really interesting because I was watching a kind of deconstruction and discussion about Gamergate, right? And which is a fantastic series, by the way. It's called Why Are You So Angry? And it's this guy, he does like 5 or 6 episodes about the Gamergate movement. And one of the things he talked about was there's like there was kind of two groups in the Gamergate movement. There were the people who were harassing and abusing and doxing and all that sort of stuff, the women and the men and stuff who the targets of the movement, right? And then there were the other people who were kind of concerned about the rhetoric of ethics and game journalism or whatever, and they both kind of had the same goal in mind, and they could each could kind of distance themselves from each other. That the latter group could kind of distance themselves from the harassment and the abuse and the awful things that one group was doing, but also kind of benefit from the thing that was happening as a whole to kind of push the movement forward and reach the same kind of end goal. I found that kind of interesting that parallel between the Gamergate and the neo-Nazi thing, because that seems like a very similar situation. That maybe there's not heaps and heaps of neo-Nazis, but there's definitely a huge amount of people who are who want kind of the same stuff, so they're happy to kind of go along with things and allow them to tolerate the awful stuff so that they can get the same stuff.
And I think that the same thing happens in a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about, sort of the abuse that people get or the online abuse. It's almost like there's a system in place where no one will ever face consequences. Where this where you could be a 16-year-old girl with 20 subs, somebody does a video on you, you've got thousands of hateful comments, right, and downvotes and everything else, and there's people saying, well, I don't agree with the hateful comments, but what can you do? And I don't, but it's like this entire system has been built up. Everybody sort of knows about it. It's there, it's obvious, it's predictable as, the sun coming up, but nobody's responsible because you can't take several thousand random people and and say, well, this group is responsible. What are you going to do against that group? I mean, maybe.
And the whole, I think I talked about this in my online abuse videos, is this the sympathizing and normalization and rationalization of the abuse for whatever end goal you may have. Just because you're not partaking in that abuse and harassment and all that sort of stuff, the fact that you are rationalizing it and normalizing it and trying to sympathizing with it, you're just as much a part of the problem.
Exactly.
Right, like silence is that tolerance.
Yeah, it's tolerance, exactly. And so you're tacitly okay with that, basically.
Can we all on three go, whoa, whoa, whoa.
Whoa.
Whoa, whoa.
Now we all joined in.
He's playing with that. Now he's going really loud. But no, I think it's very similar with what I see in the in sort of the Nazi movement, where you have Richard Spencer and then you have Richard Spencer apologists, so you have people who are going on the Dave Rubin show and he's going, okay, why don't you sit here and we'll talk about how white nationalism is so much different than white supremacy, because that's a thing that's a hair we need to split, which is just a way of rephrasing the obvious. Again, wow, it's not an apple, it's an apple. So, okay. You have people who will just say, oh, Richard Spencer is a troll. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Richard Spencer is a Duke University graduate who has spent his entire life trying to put forward this movement. Everything he has done. I mean, he's been in jail for it. He was in a Hungarian jail. Like, can we decide that is a little bit more than most trolls will go through? They don't usually set up
it's just a troll thing. It's just it's the same. It's the same thing. It's dangerous as well. He's just a troll. He's just a troll.
No, he isn't. He absolutely is not. He is a man with a goal, and he has worked very hard towards that goal. He has been in think tanks. He has published books and blogs and, started up online magazines, all with this goal. And he's always said what the goal is, and he's always talked about what he's doing and what his plans in the future are. So it's like somebody saying that, I don't know, that Apple CEO guy was just all a prank. He didn't mean to create this billion-dollar enterprise.
He just
You
got
know,
pranked,
Steve
bro.
Jobs, it was just a joke that got out of hand. What is he going to do? Like, no. When somebody spends all their life, all their time
Right.
devoted to a goal and tells you that, I think you can start to go, oh, maybe they actually mean it. Like, nowhere else would you make that jump.
Right.
Like, ah, he's
Well, then, and that's the thing. And I think, and that's the thing is that he's not just an internet troll. He's, he's been obviously employed. I don't know if he's ever been, a CEO of a company or anything. But if you think about it, then it's like, then he's in charge of hiring talent, hiring people. And he's not going to hire technically the most qualified person, because that could be a woman of color like myself. Like, I know that I would probably never get hired by him, but then it just goes to show how these people, these quote unquote trolls, actually do infiltrate our everyday life and world. And even in like LinkedIn, like I know that there's several, or even on Twitter, right, that lately people go on these rants and say like racist things, and and then people actually are calling them out and then calling their employer and saying, hey, these people should be fired. But so it's until that these people kind of speak out that we actually really know who they are, and that then it does affect people in their everyday lives, because they are, supervisors of this, managers of that. And you see that if they're racist, like who else is, or who else has bias, right? In these corporations and these companies where, or in government where you're trying to get a job.
And like also just denying the fact that he has influence and a following. Okay, he's just a troll. Yeah, but he's legitimizing this awful racist white nationalist worldview in people who, okay, let's just exercise the idea that he's just a troll, but that doesn't change the fact that he's legitimizing this idea across through in all these people. Even when you look at the speech that he gave, where there's all these friggin' Nazis there giving the quote unquote Roman salute. I mean, that's
right.
He's having a real world influence and allowing these people to come to light. People who might have before been these kind of closet white supremacist racists or whatever, who couldn't, speak out. But now that there's these people like Richard Spencer and like Trump who are kind of legitimizing these ideas. I'm not saying that Trump is necessarily the same as Richard Spencer. I'm just saying that he is having a real world effect and legitimizing and normalizing these awful racist white supremacist fucking ideas. And just you could say he's just a troll, but that doesn't change the real world influence that he has.
Yep, absolutely agree.
Well, guys, I think I'm coming to the end of my endurance.
How long have you been on here, Kristi?
Wonderful, Kristi.
You've been here almost the whole time with me. I started at 7 p.m. my time, and it's going on 11 at night.
Woo!
Oh, Jesus. That's like 4 hours, baby.
Yeah, that was a marathon. But it was such a good conversation. It went so fast. It was so easy. I didn't mind. And I would love to keep going, but I should probably go to bed, because even though I was on strike today, I'm back to work tomorrow. So
I'm on strike every day, so.
Yes, well, this is why you're in basically every hangout I'm on, because I'm trying to get as much, Michael time as possible before if you disappear again anytime soon.
Yeah, baby.
Well, hey, you guys, thank you so much. And also thank you to the other guests who joined earlier in the evening. This was just such a great time. And I really enjoyed.
We scared Kevin away. I don't know what happened there.
He dropped out. I thought he dropped out for like sound reasons and was going to come back, and he didn't.
No,
but
he hates us.
presumably, yeah, that's probably it. Yeah, you and your donkey balls, Michael.
It was nice to meet you, Laura.
And yes, you as well.
Absolutely. Do you have a channel?
Oh my goodness! What a surprise to see you.
Laura?
No, she's a civilian.
All right.
She's a gnome. Yeah.
Just a really cool woman that I want to spend more time with. We met at the march, or the night before. There was
cool.
We did the inauguration tickets burning. So
Nice.
yeah. All right. So
Okay.
yes, wrapping up. I'm going to hit stop broadcast here. So let me do my outro, guys. Thank you guys for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks to my guests. I've been Kristi. You've been awesome, and I will see you guys again really soon. Bye-bye.